Hi there! Have you ever wondered why some sounds goes well together and some other not? Why some sounds can merge beautifully and be consonant, and some others can be less pleasing to the ear and be dissonant? There are different ways to explain that, but we have to go back to what sound is in its nature. What is sound? Sound is a variation of pressure that moves through the air. Translation, sound is a vibration of air. The particles in the air get all compressed, then stretched out, then compressed, then stretched out, etc. And that's how the sound propagates, like the waves on the surface of water when you throw a rock in a lake, for instance. That is also why there is no sound in space. If there is no particle of air to be compressed or stretched, there is no sound propagation. So this vibration will make our eardrum vibrate inside our ear, and our brain will be like, hey man, you are hearing a sound. To know if two sounds are consonant or dissonant, we can compare their frequency of oscillation. Basically, the simpler the ratio is between these frequencies, the more consonant they are. So if I take a sound that vibrates at 220 Hz, for example, the more consonant sound that can go with it is 440 Hz, which is the double of that frequency, so they have the simplest ratio of 2:1. The next most consonant sound that can go with this 220 Hz is 660 Hz, which is the triple of these frequencies, so they have a ratio of 3:1. And then the next most consonant sound that can go with us is 880 Hz with a ratio of 4:1. And if we keep going, we start creating a series that we call the harmonic series. So the simpler the ratio is between two frequencies, the more consonant they are. And that means that the more consonant they are, the more frequently their waves will sync up. That is also why when two sounds are dissonant, we can hear a beating in the sounds. That are the waves that go slowly in and out of sync. This is also how we can define purity of a consonance. This is the absence of beating when two sounds play together. We can use that to create our first musical scale and play actual music. We've settled that the most consonant sound to go with our 220 Hz sounds would be 440 Hz, so twice as high, with a ratio of 2:1. And they are actually so consonant that they are considered the same notes, with different pitches, but if our 220 Hz is an A, 440 Hz is also an A but one octave higher. So that means every time we multiply or divide a frequency by 2, we actually are getting the same note but one octave higher or lower. So the most consonant interval between two different notes would be when they have a ratio of 3:1. And that is what we'll use to build our scale. So let's start with our A at 440 Hz. We can add one note above and one note below using the 3:1 ratio. And then we can multiply or divide these frequencies by 2 to get the same notes, but closer to our 440 Hz note. We can then go one step further with these new notes we just created by multiplying or dividing their frequencies by 3 to get other new notes. By bringing these frequencies to the narrowest range possible, we can end up with this suite of notes. And there we created our first pentatonic scale with 5 notes per octave. That is probably the kind of scale that is the most used around the world. It's used a lot in Chinese music, blues, country and folk music, for example. The frequencies in our scale actually correspond to the note G, A, B, D, E, which is the pentatonic scale of G major or the pentatonic scale of E minor. And from there we can add 2 notes again, so we can end up with these frequencies that correspond to the notes G, A, B, D, E, F sharp, which is the scale of G major. And this is how the first scales were created. In this kind of scale, the first note is called the tonic, and then there is the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, the seventh, and this is why we call the next note the octave, oct meaning 8, which is technically the same note than the tonic. Now back to the harmonic series we made at the beginning of the video and compare it with the notes we have in our scale. So the first note, harmonic 1, is our fundamental, and the harmonics 2, 4 and 8 are different octaves. Then the most consonant notes with our tonics in our scale would be the 5th and the 4th, as we use the 3:1 ratio of the harmonic 3 to make them, and the 4th is a 5th below the tonic. Then the most consonant note with our tonic would be the 3rd and the 6th. If we look the relation between our 3rd and the fundamental, we find a relation of 64 on 81, which is almost 4/5. We choose the 5:1 ratio of the 5th harmonic in the harmonic series, and the 6th is the 3rd below the tonic. And finally, the 2 last notes, the 7th and the 2nd, are the most dissonant with the tonic in our scale. This 3rd, that is almost exact but not perfect, will begin to cause problems at some point, but we'll see why a bit later. Truth is, in nature, there's no sound that vibrates at only one frequency at a time. A sound that vibrates at only one frequency is a sine wave. That's what only one frequency sounds like. Any other sound is in fact always a cocktail of a lot of frequencies. Among them, the lower frequencies is called the fundamentals. That's often the note we hear and the one we can sing, and all the other frequencies are called the overtones. We split these overtones into two families, the harmonic overtones and the inharmonic overtones. The harmonic overtones participate to the musical note we hear in the sound, the one that we can sing. They are parts of the harmonic series of the fundamental, which means that their frequency is a multiple of the fundamental's frequency, the fundamental being the first harmonic. The second harmonic being twice this frequency, which is the octave. The third harmonic being 3 times this frequency, which is the fifth. The fourth harmonic is another octave. And the fifth harmonic is the third, etc. They all participate to the musical note we hear in the sound. In fact, when a string of a guitar vibrates, all these harmonics are present in the sound we hear. When you play a natural harmonic, you isolate some of this frequency that were already there. With an open string, we hear the fundamental. With your finger touching the string just above the 12th fret, which is the middle of the string, you hear the second harmonic. With your finger touching the string above the 7th fret, which is the third of the string length, you hear the third harmonic, etc. All the other overtones that are not part of this harmonic series are called inharmonic overtones and participate to the tone of the sound. If a sound has too much inharmonic overtones, then we can't really hear a note in it. In this case, we talk about inharmonic sounds. It's the case of a percussive sound like a snare or cymbal, for example. Drummers know that you still have to tune your drum kit, and this is because the sounds found in nature are rarely 100% harmonic or inharmonic, but more often a mixture between the two. So these harmonic overtones participate to the musical note we hear in the sound, and these inharmonic overtones affect the tone of the sound. As a practical example, a pure sine wave is the only sound that has no overtone, because that's how one frequency sounds. Then if we add odd overtone from our harmonic series, the fundamentals being 1, so we add the 3, 5 and so on, then our sine wave begins to become a square wave. Then if we begin to add the other overtones of our series, our wave turns into a sawtooth wave. This means that a sawtooth wave is richer in overtones than a square wave, which is richer in overtones than a sine wave. But these three waves are 100% harmonic sounds and are actually at the basis of sound design in any synthesizer. As an example of a 100% inharmonic sound, you have the white noise, which is all the frequencies between 20 Hz and 20 kHz, all at the same level, which is at the basis of a synthetic snare or cymbal sound. Mix harmonic sounds with inharmonic frequencies and you can theoretically recreate any sound you've heard. In fact, overtones are the reason why a piano and a trumpet sounds different. It's because they don't have the same overtones in it, harmonic and inharmonic, and each overtone resonates at different levels. Let me show you. We can clearly see the harmonic series in the three first sounds, the lower sound being the fundamental, and with each harmonics at different levels. And we can also see the inharmonic component of each sound. In the two last sounds we can't really see any harmonic series, these are inharmonic sounds. In the last video we said that in a major scale the most consonant sounds were the tonic, were the fifth and the fourth, and then there were the third and the sixth, and then came the second and the seventh. In fact, the more consonant two sounds are, the more overtone they have in common. So if we take a sound with its first harmonics overtones and compare it to the notes in the scale that are the more consonant with it, then we can see this overtone lining up for the fifth, for the fourth, the third, the fifth, the second, and the seventh. If you're in a choral singing a note and a bunch of other people sing the fifth of that note, you can actually hear the harmonics overtones bounce in the room around you, and that's pretty awesome. A trained ear can actually hear some overtone directly within one note being played, and we can also use that to tune some instruments. A trained ear can hear some of the harmonic overtones contained within one note, and these overtones are actually what was used to tune clavichords and other instruments, especially the third harmonic of the harmonic series, the fifth, the easiest to hear, considered to be the most consonant interval of all. We used to tune our instruments fifth by fifth. To have the fifth of a note, you can multiply its frequency by 3 and then divide it by 2 to lower the note by 1 or 2 octaves. So it's multiplying this frequency by 3/2 or 3/4. So you would tune the first note, let's say C, at 264 Hz. Then from C you would tune the G note, which is the fifth of C, and you can do that by ear actually. You'll need good ears, but you do that by listening to beatings in the sound. So from this G note you could find the D, then you could find the A, then the E, then the B, then F sharp, D flat, A flat, E flat, B flat, and F. This figure is called the circle of fifth. The way we tune an instrument is called a temperament, and this particular way of tuning an instrument from fifth to fifth is called the Pythagorean temperament. It was made by Pythagoras himself. Yes, the same Pythagoras you heard of in middle school. He is considered to be the first one to theorize the harmonic series, and there, the first temperament. That was the temperament used up to the 15th century, when Occidental music used to favor fifth and fourth, which was considered the only consonant intervals, but it came with two issues. The first issue is that if we keep adding fifth at the end of a circle after the F, we should land on a C, but the C we get by multiplying the frequency of our F isn't exactly the frequency we began with. These diagonal lines. So this interval has to be flattened so we can land on the C we're supposed to have. In result, this interval becomes dissonant, and it is called the wolf interval because it reminds the scream of that animal. Here is what it sounds like. The solution was to put this dissonant interval on an interval that was less used, or in an interval that we had to avoid carefully. The second issue was that the third was not pure neither. An interval of major third can be seen as 4 consecutive fifths. See there, from C to E, for example. E is the major third of C, and there are 4 fifths between these two. And if we compare the E in our circle here, which is the third of C, and the third that is in the harmonic series of C, the fifth harmonic overtones, we can see that their frequencies are not equal neither. It wasn't really a problem before the 15th century, when the third was considered dissonant, and this tuning probably has something to do with that. But it became a problem when Occidental music was tending to favor intervals of third and sixth, and the solution there was the mean-tone temperament, or mean-tone temperaments I should say, because there are several. The difference between the natural third found in the harmonic series and the third found in the Pythagorean temperament is called a comma. And as the third is 4 consecutive fifths, the solution was to lower each fifth by 1/4 of that comma. So our thirds would be pure, sacrificing the purity of the fifth in the process. That was good enough for a music that favored the thirds and the sixth, but the problem of the wolf interval was not resolved yet. In fact, the last fifth was below the pure fifth that we were supposed to have, and even further from it, so the wolf interval was even worse. But it also means that the 4 thirds that were passing by this wolf interval were false as well, so you had to avoid all of them, and you had to avoid certain tonalities completely. So, to minimize this problem, other mean-tone temperaments lowered each fifth by 1/6 or 1/8 of a comma, bringing the last fifth closer to a pure interval, but sacrificing the purity of each third in the process, and any tuning was still bound to certain tonalities. Because of that, for the next few centuries, musicians have been creating different irregular temperaments, which made each tonality sound differently due to the irregularities of the tunings. That was until the 19th century, when the equal temperament was created. That is the temperament we are still using today. The principle of the equal temperament is that every note in the chromatic scale are separated by an equal interval. This means that all the notes end up being slightly offset and all the intervals end up being slightly off as well. Technically, this tuning that we use today is the most inexact of all time, but it makes all fifths and all thirds equally consonant as well. So we don't have to avoid any tonalities. They all get equivalence. We lose the specific character that each tonality had in irregular temperaments, but it allows us to travel from a tonality to another within the same music, without having to avoid any of the tonality neither. As an egotist example, this is why my 98 chord song was even possible. And that also means that we can transpose any song in any key without having to retune our instrument. So that is with this technically most inexact temperament of all that we get the more freedom. From there, we can fiddle freely with our scales and wander in any tonalities. In our musical system, an octave is divided in 12 equal intervals, so we have 12 notes per octave. And in the most used scales, including major and minor, there are 7 of those notes. The name of these scales will then depend on 2 things: the fundamental, the first note of the scale, and the way the note is spaced throughout the octave. Let's take the scale of C major, for example. It's easy, it's only the white keys of a piano keyboard. So C is the root key of the scale, the note that feels like home, and major is defined by the sequence of intervals from the root key. So in this scale of C major, the first interval is from C to D. That's 2 semitones, so 1 tone. The next interval between D and E is also 2 semitones, so 1 tone. then one semitone between E and F, one tone between F and G, one tone between G and A, one tone between A and B, and there's one last semitone to go back to C. So the major scale is defined by the sequence of interval one tone, one semitone, one tone, one semitone. And this is something we can transpose to any tonality to have any major scale. So if I want the major scale of G, for instance, it goes G, one tone A, one tone B, one semitone C, one tone D, one tone E, one tone F sharp, then one semitone back to G, which is the scale we ended up with in the video on Consonances and Dissonances. The C major scale works because we define C as our home note, but every major scale have a relative minor scale. This is another scale that would be minor, but will use exactly the same notes. So the only difference between a major scale and its relative minor is the fundamental note that we call home, that feels like home. The relative minor scale of a major scale is the one that takes its sixth note as a fundamental. So for the C major scale, for example, the relative minor scale is A minor, taking the exact same notes from the C major scale that makes A, B, C, D, E, F, G. That's the A minor scale. Once again, this minor scale is defined by the sequence of interval that build it. So the first interval is from A to B, that is one tone, then from B to C is one semitone, C to D is one tone, D to E is one tone, E to F is one semitone, F to G is one tone, and G back to A is one tone. So the sequence that defines a minor scale is one tone, one semitone, one tone, one tone, one semitone, one tone, one tone. And we can also transpose that to any tonality, to have any minor scale. So as an example, let's make the minor scale of E. It goes E, one tone F sharp, one semitone G, one tone A, one tone B, one semitone C, one tone D, and one tone back to E. And this is the relative minor of the G major scale. They use exactly the same notes. In the same fashion, from a major scale, we can take any note as a fundamental, as our home note. And then we start building a whole bunch of new scales. And this is what we call modes. Starting with the C major scale, the C major scale is actually called the Ionian mode, or mode of C. The scale that uses the same notes but starting from D is called the Dorian mode, or mode of D. The scale that uses the same notes but starting from E is called the Phrygian mode, or mode of E, and then the mode of F is called the Lydian mode. The mode of G is called the Mixolydian mode. The mode of A is called Aeolian mode, that's the minor scale. And the mode of B is called the Locrian mode. As any scales, these modes are defined by the suite of interval that build them, so they can be built from any root note. For example, if I want the Lydian scale of G, we'll start with a G and then we'll follow the sequence of the Lydian scale, which is one tone, one tone, one tone, one semitone, one tone, one tone, one semitone. That makes the scale G, A, B, C sharp, D, E, F sharp, G. That's the Lydian G scale. It exists other scales that are a bit more exotic, which are not made from the same sequence than the major scale. Just to name a few, there is the acoustic or Lydian dominant scale, which goes one tone, one tone, one tone, one half tone, one tone, one half tone, one tone. Or the Byzantine scale, that goes one semitone, one tone and a half, one semitone, one whole tone, one semitone, one tone and a half, and one semitone. There are also less harmonic scales like Messiaen's tone-semitone scale, which follow the sequence tone, semitone, tone, semitone, tone, semitone, etc. But we may see these exotic scales more in details in other videos. First, we'll see how chords are made and how to find each chord of each tonality. A chord is a set of notes played together. And the name of these chords depend on the root notes, on how many notes there are in it, and the interval that separates each note. Triads are chords that are made of 3 notes. They are at the basis of all chords. To build them, we'll need a root note, which will give the chord its name, then a third and a fifth. So if I want to make a chord of C, I'll take a C, the third E, and the fifth G. That makes a C major chord. Because between C and E, there are 2 tones, which is an interval of a major third. And between C and G, there is an interval of 3.5 tones, which is an interval of a perfect fifth. So a root note plus a major third plus a perfect fifth makes a major chord, which is considered to be a happy chord. It sounds happy. To make it a minor chord, I have to lower the third by a semitone, so it becomes E flat, and the interval between the root note C and E flat is 1 tone and a half, which is an interval of a minor third. The interval between C and G is still a perfect fifth. So a root note plus a minor third plus a perfect fifth make a minor chord. That's considered to be a sad chord. It sounds kinda sad. The only difference between a major chord and a minor chord is the third. This note alone will determine the state of the whole chord. And you can actually change the order of the notes, the voicing. It will still stay the same chord. For example, if I write my C major chord E, G, C, it can be described as an E chord with a third and a sixth, but in fact it is still a C major chord. That's what we call an inversion. If I remove the third in my chord, the chord is neither minor or major. This is what we call a power chord. This is just a root note with a fifth, and it's used a lot by guitarists. So I can alter my third to make my chord major or minor, but I can also alter the fifth. If I move my perfect fifth up a semitone, it becomes augmented, and if I move it down a semitone, it becomes diminished. So a chord with a major third and an augmented fifth is called an augmented chord, such as C, E, G sharp. That's a C augmented chord. It's considered to be more of a bright chord. The other way around, a chord with a minor third and a diminished fifth is called a diminished chord, such as C, E flat, G flat. It's considered to be a dark chord. And that's pretty much all the most used triads: major, minor, augmented and diminished. We could create a triad with a major third and a diminished fifth, for example, which I heard was called a hard diminished chord, which sounds harsh, but it's not really used. In fact, if we see the three notes together, C, E and G flat, it's often as being part of another chord, other than C, often with at least a fourth note added. So this hard diminished chord with a major third and a diminished fifth is not really used as is. In fact, every chord can be considered as a superposition of thirds. A major chord is a major third plus a minor third. A minor chord is a minor third plus a major third. An augmented chord is two major thirds stacked up, and a diminished chord is two minor thirds stacked up. Maybe that explains a bit better why we don't really use the major third with a diminished fifth, as then there wouldn't be an interval of third between the third and the fifth in our chord. So when you're using a scale, you can build your chords by stacking up thirds. In practice, that means that when you're using a scale, you can build your chords by taking one note every two, starting with the root note. The space between each note will then define the nature of the chord. So in the scale of C major, for instance, that's all the white key on the keyboard. If I build a C chord, I start from C, I leave a note, then take a note, that's E, I leave a note, then take a note, that's G. So we have our major chord C, E, G that we had before. But we can build a chord for every note in the scale in the exact same way. So for a D chord, I start from D, leave a note, take a note, leave a note, take a note. So we have D, F, A. With 1 tone and a half between D and F, that's a minor third. And with 2 tones between F and A, that's a major third. So a minor third with a major third, that's a minor chord. If we build every chord of the C major scale, we find that our C chord is major, the D and E chords are minor, the F and G chords are major, the A chord is minor, and the B chord is diminished. In the same way we refer to every note in the scale with Arabic numerals, we refer to the chords of a scale with Roman numerals. That will come handy to talk about our chord progressions. Just know that these are called degrees. The first degree, second degree, third degree, etc. The fifth degree is a bit special. It's called the dominant, but we'll get back to it. By stacking thirds on top of each other or taking one note every two, you can create chords. But you don't have to stop at a triad with 3 notes. You can add more. When you add more notes to your triad, you're creating an extended chord. If you add one extra note, you add the 7th, so that's a 7th chord. If you add another extra note, you add the 9th, so that's a 9th chord. Another extra note and you're adding an 11th, so that's called an 11th chord. Another extra note and you're adding a 13th note, so that's called a 13th chord. You get it. If I try to make a 13th chord from C in the C major scale, that makes C, E, G, B, D, F, A. So technically this is the 13th chord. Yeah. Again, the nature of these extended chords will depend on the interval between each of their notes. So let's define all these intervals once and for all. Every interval is defined by the distance between the note of the chord and the root note. Some intervals will be called perfects. If they are extended by a semitone, they are called augmented, and if they are shortened by a semitone, they are called diminished. Then some intervals are called either major or minor, with a semitone between the two states. If a major interval is extended by one semitone, it becomes augmented, and if a minor interval is shortened by one semitone, it becomes diminished. But these are more rare instances. To know which intervals are perfect or major or minor, just remember the C major scale, as everything seems to be built around that. That's all the white key on the keyboard. In the C major scale, the 4th and the 5th are perfect intervals, and the 2nd, the 3rd, the 6th and the 7th are all major intervals. From there, it gives you all the reference intervals you need to know if your 6th or 7th is minor or major. For example, if you have 4 tones between 2 notes, that's like the interval between a C and a G sharp or A flat. So that's an interval of either an augmented 5th or a minor 6th. For the 7th, it is a major 7th if the note is 5 tones and a half above the root note. That's a semitone below its octave. Or if it is 2 tones above the perfect 5th. It becomes a minor 7th if it's a whole tone below the root note, or 1 tone and a half above the perfect 5th. We can also observe that the major chords in these scales are built upon the perfect intervals, and the minor or diminished chords are built upon the non-perfect intervals. This figure can come in very handy as a reference, and it should definitely be on the cheat sheet if you need one. So now that we know how to build a 7th chord by adding a 7th on top of a triad, and we know how we can identify different intervals, let's see the most used 7th chord. A major triad with a minor 7th, which would be a minor 3rd above the 5th, is probably the most common 7th chord and is called a dominant 7th chord, because it is often used on the 5th degree, which is the dominant degree. For a C chord, they will make C, E, G, B flat, and it would be noted C7. If we have a major triad with a major 7th, they would make a major 7th chord. So for C, they would make C, E, G, B, and it would be noted C capital M7. Then if we have a minor triad plus a minor 7th, that makes a minor 7th chord. So for a C chord, there would be C, E flat, G, B flat. They would be noted C lowercase m 7. You can also have a minor triad with a major 7th. That would be a minor major 7th chord. That would make, for instance, C, E flat, G, B. That would be noted C lowercase m capital M7. This one is a bit more rare. Then we can have a diminished triad with a minor 7th. That'd be called a half diminished 7th chord. So for example, C, E flat, G flat, B flat. That would be noted C lowercase m7 flat 5. Or like this, a C with a crossed circle. That's a half diminished 7th chord. And to have a fully diminished 7th chord, there would be a diminished triad with a diminished 7th. So for C, it would be C, E flat, G flat, B double flat. I like this one because it's a bit confusing. Even though the B technically becomes the same note than an A, it still serves the function of a 7th, as we stack up minor thirds on top of each other to make this one. But A would be a 6th. So we keep the name B for that note to show that it's considered a 7th, but it's double flat, it's diminished. So the C diminished 7th chord could be noted C dim 7. This one is very dissonant as it has 2 intervals of diminished 5th in it. I like it a lot. Now with an augmented triad we can have a minor 7th. That would be called an augmented 7th chord. So on a C chord, that would be C, E, G sharp, B flat. This one is sort of a break in the rule, as it doesn't have an interval of a 3rd between the 5th and the 7th. This chord is also used a lot on chords of 5th degree, and is also known as a dominant augmented 7th chord, and that'd be noted C plus 7. With an augmented triad, we can have a major 7th. That would be called an augmented major 7th chord. So on a C chord, that would be C, E, G sharp, B, and that'd be noted C capital M7 sharp 5, or C plus capital M7. Now that we know what the different 7th chords look like, we can identify each 7th chord of our C major scale. If we take each note of the scale and build the 7th chord, so remember you start with the root notes and then you take one note every 2, so leave a note, take a note, leave a note, take a note, and see the intervals that compose them, we find that the C chord, the 1st degree, is the C major 7th, the 2nd degree is the D minor 7th, the 3rd degree is a E minor 7th, The 4th degree is a F major 7th, the 5th degree is a G dominant 7th, the 6th degree is a A minor 7th, and the 7th degree is a B half diminished 7th. This gives you the states of all the 7th chord in a major scale. And because all major scales have a relative minor scale that use the exact same notes, you can have the 7th chord of a minor scale by simply starting from the 6th degree, because that's where a relative minor scale begins. So these are the 7th chord of a minor scale. You can add other notes on top of that to create 9th, 11th or 13th chord, but that may already be a lot of information. I would like to talk a bit about how to actually use this chord to create our chord progression first. To build the music, we'll build a chain of chords that will play in a certain order with a certain rhythm, and this is this chain of chords that we call our chord progression. And there are certain rules, or tendencies rather, that you can follow to build them. I actually don't really like to call them rules because following them is not really an obligation. Music theory hasn't been built as a rigid set of rules that you must follow. It's the music that has been made first, and then we try to find out why certain things were working. And those rules were then deduced from that. And it is part of the fun to try to break certain rules while making music. But following them is just a higher rate of success, so I guess it's better to know the rules before trying to break them. It's better to understand what you're doing to do it better. Anyway, so each chord of the scale has a number that we call degree that is related to the number of the note in the scale. From there you can put together a chain of chords using the chords of the scale you're using, and as all the chords are from the same scale or the same tonality, it should work just fine. So when you're using different chords from a tonality, some degrees in the scale will be sensed in a particular way, bringing different colors to the progression. Some will bring tension and some other will bring resolution. For instance, the chord 5, which is called the dominant, will create a tension that will want to be resolved by going back to the chord 1, the home chord. This is because the first note and the 5th note of the scale have a special relationship. They are very consonant. If the 1 is the home you're searching for, then the 5 would be like the neighbor's home. When you see it, you know you're almost there. So the 5th degree brings a tension, and the 1st degree brings the resolution. And this tension and resolutions are something you want to play a lot with. Because writing music, I guess, is a bit like writing a dialogue. Parts of your chains of chord or melodic line would be sentences, and there would be questions and answers and suppositions. And some chord progression that has been used a lot has become very recognizable and can be used like punctuation to build our sentences. These little chord progressions are called cadences. The progression that goes 5 to 1 is called the authentic cadence. It's often prepared by a 2, so the full authentic cadence would be 2-5-1. In C major, which is all the white keys of the keyboard, that makes D minor, G major, C major. And this is the most conclusive cadence. It acts like a full stop in a sentence. It's a good cadence to end a song, for example. It's very conclusive and we finish with a big resolution. If your sentence ends on 5, so often 2-5, you prepare it like a perfect cadence, but you stop on the 5, like an unfinished cadence. You stay hanging in the air. This is called the half cadence, and it acts a bit like a question mark or a comma. It creates a sentence that finishes on a little tension that needs to be answered. You can also prepare an authentic cadence, but instead of going to the 1st degree, you go to a different degree. That is called a deceptive cadence, or an interrupted cadence. The chord of the 1st degree is often replaced by the chord of the 6th degree. So in C major, there would be D minor, G major, A minor. This is not a conclusive cadence. It's like we prepare the end of the sentence, but at the last moment we continue for a bit longer. The deceptive cadence is a great tool to break the expectation and add an element of surprise to shift the mood of a sentence, for example. The last cadence we'll see here is when the progression goes from 4 to 1. This is called the plagal cadence. This is a conclusive cadence that will sound like the end of a sentence, but it's not as conclusive as the authentic 5 to 1. It is used a lot in rock music, for example. So let's try to make a song by taking advantage of all those cadences. Okay, let's start by picking some chords at random to kickstart our creativity. So between 1 and 7 we have 4, 2, 7 and 3. Cool, that be our main chord progression, and I'll copy that 4 times to have 4 lines. At the end of each line I'll insert the different cadences we saw. So on the first line I'll squeeze the 7 and the 3 in the same bar to have room to finish on the 5. That's our half cadence. On the second line I'll replace the 3 by a 4 and squeeze it in the same bar than the 7 to have some room to finish on the 1. So we have a 4 to 1, that's our plagal cadence. On the third line I'll prepare an interrupted cadence just like an authentic cadence. I'll put the 5 at the very end of the line so it finishes on the first beat of the next line. That will sound more conclusive, except that I'll land on the 6 instead of a 1 in the next bar. So that's our interrupted cadence. For the last line I'll do exactly the same thing except that I'll land on a 1. So we finish on a nice authentic cadence. In the last line I also replace the 2 and the 7 by a 5 and a 4 to have that nice descent of 6, 5, 4, 3. And there we have our chord progression with the 4 to 7 that will be the core of our progression. And then first we have a half cadence that brings a bit of suspension, then a plagal cadence that brings a little resolution, then we have an interrupted cadence that adds some motion with a bit of variety there, and then we finish on an authentic cadence that is more conclusive. For this chord progression I decided to go for the tonality of C minor, because minor is cool, and when you are in a minor tonality you can make the 5 chord major when they prepare a cadence, even though they're supposed to be minor in these tonalities. It adds some tension and makes these cadences better. I'll explain why more in details in the next video, but just so you know, I made these two last 5 chord major. So in C minor, this is the chord progression we end up with. Play that with a rhythm, add a bass, a drum and a little melody on top, and here is one way this can sound. You can also play any of these 5th degree chords in their dominant 7th form to add some tension. And another reason why this 5th degree creates a tension with the 1st degree is because of how the chord itself is built. In the scale of C major, the 5th degree chord, which is G, is built with the root note G, the major 3rd B, and the perfect 5th D. This note B is very close, just a semitone away from the tonic C of our scale. And this fundamental have such a strong role in the scale that this B wants to climb up this little semitone to go to the tonic. That's why it's called the leading tone, because it creates this friction that generally leads to the tonic. If we look at the minor scale, like A minor, the 5th degree is supposed to be a minor chord, right? But when you use this chord to make a cadence, so from 5 to 1 in A minor would be E minor to A minor, when you make a cadence you can make it major to have this leading tone of a half step below the tonic and add this friction to your chord progression. So the E chord would lead more easily to the A chord using this leading tone. In fact, any dominant chord, a chord of 5th degree, that is preparing a cadence can be made major in any tonality. So in A minor, it allows you to use the note G sharp that is normally not in the scale. The minor scale, as we've seen so far, is actually only one kind of minor scale, that we call the natural minor scale. This possibility to play a major chord on a 5th degree on a minor scale adds an alto note, and that actually creates an alternative minor scale, that we call harmonic minor scale. Harmony is the combination of several tones played simultaneously, thus chords. This harmonic minor scales allows us to have a major chord on the 5th degree, and therefore create better, authentic cadence in a minor tonality. In the same way we did in the video about scales, we can transpose this scale to any tonality, as long as we follow the sequence of interval that build it. So the sequence of interval that build it is 1 tone, 1 semitone, 1 tone, 1 tone, 1 semitone, 1 tone and a half, 1 semitone. This scale is great harmonically, but melodically, this 1 tone and a half between the 6th and the 7th note is quite a big gap, as to make a great melody, smaller intervals are often preferred, and this bothered composers enough for them to create a 3rd minor scale, by raising the 6th note by a semitone. The gap between the 6th and the 7th notes being now reduced to 1 tone. This is what we call the melodic minor scale, and the sequence of interval that defines it is 1 tone, 1 semitone, one tone, one tone, one tone, one tone, one semitone. In fact, this melodic minor scale is just like the major scale, except the third is minor. The handy thing is that when you're using a minor tonality, you can rather freely use the natural, harmonic and melodic minor scales at the same time, depending on the context. Mainly using the natural scale, then using the harmonic scale for cadences and the melodic scale for certain melodic movements, which can make the minor tonalities very rich in possibilities. So when we play a chord of 5th degree, its third will create a tension, and we can emphasize this tension by making the chord a 7th chord. For a G chord, it will become G, B, D, F. The interval between the B and the F here is a diminished 5th, and this is very dissonant. This dissonance adds to the friction created by the leading tone, making it even more powerful. This configuration, a major third with a perfect 5th and a minor 7th, is called a dominant 7th chord, because that's the type of chord we often use on a dominant chord to be resolved on the tonic. Using the same logic, you can also use this dominant 7th chord on any 5th degree of any scale if it's preparing a cadence. So I can resolve this G7 chord by going to C minor instead of C major. Or I can use a E7 chord to resolve on either A major or A minor chord. Or I can use a D7 to go to either a G major or G minor. These dominant chords and dominant 7th chords are very useful in many situations. But before we get there, in the next video I'll explain a bit more about this circle of 5th, which is one of the more powerful tools a composer can have. This figure is called the circle of 5th, because it shows all the notes going from 5th to 5th. So here the 5th of C is G, and the 5th of G is D, the 5th of D is A, etc. As all the notes are arranged by 5th, we can easily see what the 5th of each note by going clockwise on the circle. But as the 4th is the 5th below the tonic, we can also quickly see what the 4th of each note by going anti-clockwise on the circle. So the 4th of G is C, the 4th of C is F, the 4th of F is B flat, and so on and so forth. But more than notes, this circle represents tonalities, and this circle allows you to quickly know which notes are in each tonality. The tonality of C major, that is at the top, is made of only natural notes, which means that it's all the white keys on the piano keyboard. Then all the tonalities that are on the right side of the circle will have sharp notes in them. Each step you go clockwise will add one sharp note, and the sharp notes appears in that order: F, C, G, D, A, E, B. As a mnemonic to remember it, it's written there on the circle, from F to B. So the G major scale begins with a G and will have one sharp note, which will be F sharp. So the G major scale is G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp. The D major scale begins with a D and will have two sharp notes, which are F and C. So that's D, E, F sharp, G, A, B, C sharp. One last example, the B major scale will have 5 sharp notes, which are F sharp, C sharp, G sharp, D sharp, and A sharp. So the B major scale is B, C sharp, D sharp, E, F sharp, G sharp, A sharp. Then all the tonality on the left-hand side of the circle will have flat notes in them. Same principle, each step you go anti-clockwise at the flat notes in the scale, and the flat notes appear in that order: B, E, A, D, G, C, F, which is the exact opposite order of the appearance of the sharp notes. So the scale of F major have one flat note, which is B flat. So the F major scale is F, G, A, B flat, C, D, E. The scale of B flat major has two flat notes, which are B flat and E flat. So the B flat major scale is B flat, C, D, E flat, F, G, A. One last example, the scale of A flat major has 4 flat notes, which are B flat, E flat, A flat, and D flat. So the A flat major scale is A flat, B flat, C, D flat, E flat, F, G. Do you remember when I said this figure can come in very handy as a reference, and it should definitely be on the cheat sheet if you need one. This is where it comes handy, because knowing these chords of the C major scales allows us to transpose them to the scales we just found in the circle of 5th. We know the first chord will be major, the second and the third degrees would be minor, the 4th and the 5th degrees would be major, the 6th minor, and the 7th diminished. So these are the chords you can use in the tonality of A flat major, for instance. In the same way, you can find all the chords of all the major tonalities around the circle. Now, looking at this circle of fifths, you should be able to find the notes of any major scales. But it doesn't stop there. As said in the video about scales, every major scale has a relative minor scale. This is a minor tonality that will use exactly the same notes than its relative major scale. The relative minor of C major is A minor, for example. From there, you can write all the minor tonalities on the circle, as they are all relative to a major scale. So in the same way that we did for the major tonalities, you can find all the notes for all the minor scales. For example, the C minor scale has 3 flat notes, which are B flat, E flat and A flat. So the C minor scale is C, D, E flat, F, G, A flat, B flat. And the C sharp minor scale has 4 sharp notes, which are F sharp, C sharp, G sharp and D sharp. So the C sharp minor scale is C sharp, D sharp, E, F sharp, G sharp, A, B. And in the same way we did with the major tonalities, you can know each chord of each minor tonalities. We know the A minor scale uses the same notes than the C major scale, so it also uses the same chords, except the scale starts on an A. So these are the chords of the A minor scales, and we can transpose them to any tonality. The first degree is minor, the second is diminished, the third degree is major, the fourth and the fifth are minor, and the sixth and seventh degrees are major. These, for instance, are the chords you can use in a C sharp minor tonality. So now we have all the tonalities around the circle, and we can quickly find the notes for each of them. It also works the other way around. You can find the tonalities you are in from the notes you have in a melody. If you have a melody where all the Fs are sharp and all the other notes are natural, you're probably in G major or E minor. If all the Bs and the Es are flat, you're probably in B flat major or G minor. The way this circle is arranged, it groups similar tonalities together. C major is close to G major because only one note, or rather one alteration, separate them. This comes very handy to make modulations, to switch from a tonality to another, because the more notes to tonality have in common, the easier it is to modulate from one to the other. From C major, for instance, it should be very easy to make a transition to A minor, as all the notes are in common. It should also be quite easy to go to G major, E minor, F major or D minor, as they all have only one note or one alteration that differ from C major. These tonalities that are close to C major are called its adjacent scales, and modulations to an adjacent scale is always smoother. And it would be more difficult to make a transition between C major and F sharp major, which is very far on the circle, as they have a lot of alteration that separate them. So when you are looking to do a modulation, the circle of fifths can be very handy to know the neighbor tones of your tonality, to know which tonality will be easier and make a smoother transition. So if you are in B minor, the adjacent scales would be D major, E minor, G major, F sharp minor and A major. And in the same way, you could find any adjacent scale for any tonality. And now I realize I haven't talked clearly about how to make these modulations, so that is what we'll talk about in the next video. In the last episode, we talked about cadences and dominant chords, basically saying that a chord of fifth degree naturally creates a tension that wants to be resolved by a chord of the first degree. And also saying that this chord of fifth degree can be major in all tonalities. And we can emphasize this tension even more by making this fifth degree chord a dominant seventh chord, with a major third and a minor seventh. For example, G7, which is a G major chord with a minor seventh, is a great chord to go to either C major or C minor, because G is the fifth of C. And we can use that to make smooth transitions between two tonalities, using a G7 chord to switch between C major and C minor, for instance. Switching from a tonality to another is called a modulation. But remember that the closer two tonalities are on the circle of fifth, the smoother the transition. So a transition between C major and C minor, while being still very possible, will not be as smooth as a transition between C major and one of its adjacent scales. And that is because between C major and C minor there are a lot more notes that are different, a lot more alterations that would make the change more drastic. So say we're in C major and we have this chord progression, C major, A minor, F major. And then we want to modulate to D minor to have this chord progression of D minor, B flat major, G minor. We can make the transition smoother by adding the A7 chord just before the D minor, A being the fifth of D. And in the same way, we could use a C7 chord if we want to go to a F major, or a D7 if we want to go to G major, for example. The authentic cadence and the tension a dominant chord creates is really handy to announce where we are going with our chord progression, and therefore to do modulations. Of course, in music you don't have to always follow all these rules strictly. In music, if it feels right, it is right, it's your music. Instead of using the authentic cadence to do a modulation, you could take advantage of other cadences, like the Playgirl 4-1 for example. But there are other ways to make smooth transition between two tonalities. One of them is the harmonic sequence. A sequence is a pattern that repeats itself, with each iteration offset by a certain interval, usually in one direction. The pattern can be melodic, which makes a melodic sequence, or the pattern can be a chord, which makes a harmonic sequence. These sequences can be tonal sequences, which means that they're all bound to one tonality. In this case, all the intervals will not be strictly the same, and all the notes used are the notes of the scales, of that tonality they are bound to. All these sequences can be real, which means that each pattern is an exact transposition of the first one. In this case, the sequence will use notes that are not in the scales we started with, so we can use that to make our modulations. So let's make one of these real sequences in 3 steps. So step 1, create a pattern or a chord. I'll take C major. Step 2, choose an interval and a direction. The most used is probably the descending fifth, so I'll take this one for the example, but ascending fifth and descending third are also rather common. And step 3, copy your patterns following the direction and the intervals of your choice. So here in my example, that would make C major, F major, B flat major, E flat major. So there I moved from C major to E flat major. This particular example works particularly well, because by going down from fifth to fifth, we follow the circle of fifth, adjacent scales to adjacent scales, each chord being the dominant chord of the following. And this is kind of the same technique than using the dominant chords but extended to several steps to reach a further tonality. This is just like a series of authentic cadences. And in the same way, if we chose to make a sequence with ascending fifth, that would be like a series of Playgirl cadences, because each chord would then be the 4th degree of the next one. You can also make another kind of modulation that is chromatic. That means by going up or down one semitone. This is often used to add interest to a melody. This type of modulation is rather drastic, as moving up or down a semitone would be quite a long jump on the circle of fifth, and this type of modulation don't always use a transition chord. Because this change of tonality can be so drastic, it is often definitive. This means if you move a whole tonality up or down a semitone, this is not to go back to the original tonality right after. Accidentals are notes that are outside of the tonality we are using, which can be a good way to add some tension to our harmony and melodies and add different flavors and emotions. A good way to implement an accidental is to use dominant chords, again, just like we used them in the previous video about modulations. Taking advantage of the authentic cadence, you can momentarily consider any of your chords as a 1st degree, so you can play its 5th degree just before it, so it would make a beautiful 5-to-1 progression. For example, we are in C major, that's all the white keys on the keyboard, and we have this chord progression: C major, A minor, D minor, G major. Then, for a moment, I can consider any of these chords, say the D minor, as the 1. I can add its own 5th degree just before it, which is A major, or even A7. This is the 5th degree of the D minor scale. And then after my D minor, I can go on with the tonality of C major I was in before. I don't have to stick with the tonality of D minor after that. D minor being the 2nd degree of my tonality, the A7 chord is then a 5 of 2. It's the 5th degree borrowed from the tonality of the 2nd degree, D minor. This borrowing allows you to add some notes that are not in the original tonality you're using. This A7 chord is made of the notes A, C sharp, E and G. See there, we're using the note C sharp that is not normally in the C major scale. So these kind of borrowings are super cool to add accidentals to your chord progression, and you can add the 5th degree of any of your degrees, the 5 of 2, 5 of 3, 5 of 4, and that allows you to use a lot of notes that are not supposed to be in the tonality you're using. But you can do more. You can also borrow a chord from a parallel tonality. Parallel tonalities are the major or minor tonality of the same key. So C major is parallel to C minor. D major is parallel to D minor. So at any times you could replace any degree of the major scale by its equivalence of its minor scale. For example, in C major, we could replace any chord of the C major scale by an equivalent chord of the C minor scale. So in this case, the C major could become a C minor, the D minor could become a D diminished, the E minor chord could become a E flat major. In this case, the third degree is then noted at a flat 3 because the E became an E flat. And then the F major could become a F minor, the G major could become a G minor, the A minor could become an A flat major, then the 6th degree can be noted flat 6, as the A became a flat A, and the B diminished could become a B flat major. And same there, it could be noted flat 7 because the B became a B flat note. Note how the major chords are written with upper cases and the minor chords are written with lower cases, with the Roman numerals. It's just a bit more simple to say which chords are major and which chords are minor. In the same way, if you come from a minor tonality, let's say A minor to take the relative of C major, so it's all the white keys again, then the A minor chord could become an A major, the B diminished could become a B minor, the C major chord could become a C sharp minor, which is noted sharp 3, and the C became a C sharp. The D minor could become a D major, the E minor could become an E major, the F major chord could become an F sharp minor, which is noted sharp 6 because the F became an F sharp, and then the G major could become a G sharp diminished, and the 7th degree is noted sharp 7 with a little O, which is diminished, as the G became a G sharp. Note as well that these sharp 6 and sharp 7 are also possible in the melodic minor scale, as the melodic A minor scale also have a F sharp and a G sharp in it, but because the C stays natural, the sharp 6 would be diminished in this case. So replacing a chord by another chord is called a substitution, and you can replace a chord by its equivalence of the parallel tonality, but you can also do that with any modes. So let's say you're in C major, you could replace the E chord of the C major scale by the E chord of the scale of C Dorian or C Phrygian, for example. But you can also make other types of substitutions, and it all comes back to the authentic cadence again. You know when a 5th degree resolves to a 1st degree. I said you could make this 5th degree chord a dominant 7th chord to emphasize the tension between the 5 and the 1. But you could also alter this 5th degree in several other ways. You can make it a diminished 7th chord, for example, which will bring a new flavor to your chord progression. So in C major, the authentic cadence would go from G7 to C. The notes that build the G7th chord are G, B, D, and F. If you make it a G diminished 7th chord, it will become G, B flat, D flat, and F flat, which is the note E on the keyboard. So there you are using the note B flat and D flat that are not in the C major scale. But you could also make these 5th degree chords an augmented chord. So in this case, the G augmented chord would be made of G, B, and D sharp. And there you're adding a D sharp that is not in the C major scale. A third way of altering the 5th degree chord would be to use a tritonic substitution. Tritonic means 3 tones, which was a forbidden interval in the Middle Age, as it is very dissonant. It was even called the devil's interval, just to give you an idea. Anyways, so tritonic substitution is used a lot in jazz, for example. Basically, you replace the dominant 7th chord of your 5th degree by the dominant 7th chord a tritone away, so 3 tones higher or lower. So in C major, you can replace the G7 chord by a D flat 7 chord. If you come 3 tones up or down from G, you'll fall on a D flat in both ways. So the D flat 7th chord would be made of D flat, F, A flat, and C flat, which is the same note of B on the keyboard. So this chord would use the notes D flat and A flat that are not in the C major scale. This tritonic substitution works particularly well when you use the full authentic cadence 2-5-1, as it will become 2 flat 2 1, allowing your bass to do a chromatic descent that will sound amazing. If the authentic cadence is the equivalent of a full stop in a sentence, then these substitutions give you a lot more option to finish your musical sentences. So all these accidentals can be a good way to add different flavor to your chord progressions. This is the 12th episode of Music Theory in 5 minutes, and we will see 6 special chords and chord progression that in special context can wear special names. Number 1, the Napolitan 6th. We kinda saw it already in the previous episode about substitutions. It is more or less the same thing that the tritonic substitution. When you are making an authentic cadence, which is a progression that goes from the chord of the 5th degree to the chord of the 1st degree, you can then replace the chord of the 5th degree by the chord that is a tritone, or 3 tones, above or below. In either major or minor tonality, you should end up with a chord that is between the 1st and the 2nd degree, so we can note that flat 2. Then if this new chord's lowest note is its 3rd, then we call it a Napolitan 6th. Let's see an example to see that clearer and why we call that a 6th. In C major, again, that's all the white keys on the piano keyboard, the 5th degree would be a G major, and the 1st degree would be a C major. Then if you transport this 5th degree 3 tones above, it will become a D flat major chord. And it's the same if you transport the G major chord 3 tones below. Now we need to put the third of this D flat major at the bass. So I'll move this D flat up an octave, so the third F becomes the lowest note. This combination of notes, D flat, F and A flat, will still be a D flat chord, but this configuration can be seen as a F with a third A flat and a 6th D flat. So this could be a F 6th chord, which is the first inversion of D flat major. And that is why we call that a Napolitan 6th. Napolitan because replacing the 5th degree by a flat 2 in this way was used a lot by the Napolitan school, which gathered a lot of huge composers of the Italian opera in the 18th century. The major chord on this flat 2 can also be used in root position or second inversion. That means with the root note at the bass or with the 5th at the bass. We can then call it a Napolitan chord. The Napolitan chord or Napolitan 6 is also very often used to go to the 5th degree and then to the 1st degree. It then occupies the function of a subdominant, and it is also as a subdominant substitution that it is described most of the time. Number 2, the Picardy third. It's also called a Picardy cadence. It happens only in minor tonalities, or in some modes where the 1st degree is a minor chord. The Picardy cadence is an alteration of a conclusive cadence that appears at the end of a whole section or at the end of a music. It is when you replace the last 1st degree, that then should be minor, by a major chord. You do that by reading the third of this chord by a semitone, and that's why we call it the Picardy third. The origin of Picardy in the name is unknown, but we often give the credit to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who defines it in his Dictionary of Music. That's where he said that this way of concluding a music survived longer in religious music and more in Picardy, a northern region of France, when there was music in a lot of cathedrals and churches. This Picardy third gives a feel of happy ending at the end of a song that is in minor, and was even perceived as being more conclusive. It could occur in an authentic cadence, but also in a plagal cadence, which is conclusive as well. Number 3, the Faurean cadence, from Gabriel Fauré. The Faurean cadence is the special form of the half cadence, which is the musical sentence that finishes on the degree 5. The half cadence is not a conclusive cadence, and it's often prepared with a 1st degree chord, so we have the progression of 1 to 5, the exact opposite of an authentic cadence. And that emphases the feeling of suspension that this cadence provides. So in C major, this half cadence could be C major to G major. Now, the Faurean cadence is a particular version of that, and it has the name of Gabriel Fauré because he used this a lot. Basically, you replace this 1st degree by a 4th degree, you play it in its dominant 7th form, and you put the 5th of that chord at the bass. Let's break it down. So we're still in C major, so we will land on the G major chord, which is our 5th degree. And just before, we put a chord of 4th degree, that is F. And then we'll make that a dominant 7th chord. So that's the root note F, the major 3rd A, the perfect 5th C, and the minor 7th E flat. Then if I put the 5th at the bass, the C is now the note that will support the whole chord. And that makes it feel a tiny bit more like the C chord we had in the regular half cadence. In theory, that makes it a little bit more effective. So this is what we call a Faurean cadence. Now you can notice that the note E flat here is not supposed to be in our scale. Well, this is kind of a borrowing from the melodic minor scale that we saw in the previous episode. The melodic minor scale is like the major scale, except the 3rd is minor. The 3rd note is flat, so we can borrow the C melodic minor where the 3rd note E is flat. That allows us to build this F dominant 7 chord. In C minor though, it's less of a borrowing as we already have a minor tonality. Anyway, so a half cadence that goes from 4 to 5 with a dominant 7 on the 4th, that's a Faurean cadence. Number 4, the Andalusian cadence. This is called a cadence, but as far as I understand it, this is more of a chord progression, as it is more intended to be played in loop instead of just finishing one of your musical sentences. The Andalusian cadence is most used in flamenco music, and an example of this chord progression can be A minor, G major, F major, E major. If we consider we are in the tonality of C major, the A minor chord would be a chord of the 6th degree, the G major would be the 5th degree, the F major would be the 4th degree, and the E major would be the chord of the 3rd degree, but with a raised 3rd, as the chord of E is usually minor in the C major tonality. So on top of that, you could play a solo using a C major scale, being careful of that E major chord. That's one way to look at it, but if we consider we are in the tonality of A minor, which uses the same note than the C major scale, then the A minor would be the 1st degree, the G major would be the 7th degree, the F major would be the 6th degree, and the E major chord would be the chord of the 5th degree. Which makes sense to have major, as in a minor tonality we can make the 5th degree major when it's preparing a cadence, to go to the 1st degree for instance. So this chord progression kind of always called the 1 of the next loop, so the progressions keeps rolling. 1, 7, 6, 5, and then back to 1. And then you can play a solo on top of that using the A minor scale. This is a second way to look at it, which is totally fine when this chord progression is looped, so we can play over it. But a lot of flamenco musics are actually written in a Phrygian mode, which is the mode of E. So the E Phrygian scale uses the exact same note than the C major scale, or the A minor scale, except that the tonal center, the first degree, is on the E. That means that the progression actually finishes on a 1, but a 1 that is major, even though it's supposed to be minor in Phrygian. It's kind of like a Picardy third we saw in the first part of this video. So as it finishes on a 1, you could theoretically use it like a regular cadence in a major or minor tonality, but that's a cadence that have a particular color as it borrows its notes from the Phrygian mode. Let's say we are in E major and we want to finish with an Andalusian cadence. Here are the chords of the E major scale as reference. If we finish with the Andalusian cadence, we finish nicely on our first degree here. But the A minor would be a minor 4th degree instead of major. The G major chord would be a flat 3. And the F major chord would be a flat 2. And it kind of makes sense to have a flat 2 just before a 1 in a cadence. It's just like the Napolitan 6 that we also saw in the first part of this video. So even if the Andalusian cadence is supposed to be played in loop at its own chord progression, let's see how it could sound like if it was used as a regular cadence. So here we are in E major and we have a chord progression that could be E major, G sharp minor, B major and F sharp minor. At the end of that, we'll add the Andalusian cadence we just saw. And just before the A minor chord, I'll add the A major chord, which is in the tonality of E major. This should make the transition smoother. So there the E major chord would be our first degree, the G sharp minor is the third, the B major would be the fifth, the F sharp minor would be the second degree, and the A major would be the fourth, that then becomes minor. And the rest of the Andalusian cadence is just as we saw it a minute ago. So here is how it could sound like. Anyway, so that is the Andalusian cadence, very popular in flamenco music. Number 5, sus4 chords. A sus4 chord is a chord that is lacking the third but have a fourth instead. Sus means suspended. That's what happens when you remove the third of a chord, it becomes suspended. And 4 because it has a fourth added. So for a C chord, for example, you could take a C, the root note, G, the fifth, we don't take the third, and add the F, the fourth. Classically, this is more of a transition chord, allowing us to go from a chord to the other by moving one note or two at a time. So for example, this C sus4 could be between an F chord and a C chord. Then from the F major chord, which is made of F, A, C, I can move only the A to G to have my C sus4 chord, and then I can move the F to have my C major chord, C, E, G. The interesting thing is that it works the exact same way in minor. If we're in C minor, the F chord would be minor, so that's F, A flat, C. Then I can move the A flat to G to have the C, F, G, that's the same C sus4 we had in major, and then I can move the F to E flat to land on a C minor chord. The fact that this sus4 chord doesn't have any third blurs the tonality it is from, as it could be major or minor, and you can use that at your advantage. Even if these are classically transition chords, you can use them like regular chords to bring this strange feeling of being between major and minor. For example, if you wrote a chord progression in major and you think it sounds a bit too happy, you could make some of the chords sus4. That's often done by some progressive rock or progressive metal bands. For example, I have this chord progression. If I change all these chords by their sus4 form, that could become. Hear the difference? And then on top of this chord progression, I could play a solo using either the G major or G minor scale, or switching between the two. The line between the two is then blurred. Number 6, sus2 chords. A sus2 chord is basically the same thing that a sus4. As you must have guessed, this is a chord without a third, but with a second added. So a C sus2 would be made of a root C, the second D, and the fifth G. In the same way, it can be used as a transition chord between two other chords. For example, you can put a C sus2 between a G chord and a C chord. This way you can make a smooth transition between these two chords by changing one note at a time. The B becomes the C, and then the D becomes the E. And in the same way than for the sus4 chords, you can use this sus2 as regular chords as well to blur the tonalities a little. Actually, sus2 chords are an inversion of sus4 chords. For example, say we're in C major and we have the C sus4 chord. If we move the C up an octave, we end up with the F, G and C, which is F sus2 chord. See, there is a F with a second and a fifth and no third. So they are basically the same chord, as they are an inversion of one another. In the fifth video, the one about chords and triads, I said that you could mix the order of the notes that make a chord and it will still be the same chord. But the order of these notes still have an importance, especially the lowest notes, the one at the base, which will define the state of that chord. And this is what we call an inversion. Let's make a C major chord as an example, which is made of C, E and G. As it has three notes, we can have three positions, with the C at the base, with the E at the base, or with the G at the base. If the root note C is at the base, then we say that the chord is in its root position. It is not inverted. The first inversion is when the third is at the base. Then we call that a sixth chord. It's because if the third of the C chord E was the root note of that chord, it would be accompanied by its third G and its sixth C. This is the first inversion of C major. Then the second inversion is when the fifth of our chord is at the base. We call that a 6/4 chord. It's because if the G was our root note, it would be accompanied by its fourth C and its sixth E. This is the second inversion of C major. The order of the notes above the bass doesn't really matter, as it is the lowest note that defines the inversion. When you're writing a harmony, the way the notes of your chord are laid out, the voicing, is something you want to keep in mind, because there are some things that are generally preferable to do or to avoid. So here are 5 tips to write better voicings. Number 1, if in your chord progression 2 consecutive chords have some notes in common, then these common notes should generally be played at the same pitch by the same voices in the harmony. For example, if I have a progression that goes C major to A minor, here I have written the 2 chords on 4 voices, the bass, the tenor, the alto and the soprano. Here is the C major chord with the notes C, E, G and C, and here is the A minor chord with the A, a C, a E and a A. So as you can see, the notes C and E are commons to these 2 chords. So I should generally extend the C and the E from the first chord. Here the C played by the soprano and the E played by the tenor, but I could also extend the C played at the bass. Number 2. When you spread the notes of your chords on different octaves, it is preferable to keep the notes of the harmony gathered to have only one line apart that will play the melody. You may not notice it when all the lines are played by different instruments, so the best example may be a choral of 4 voices. See here if I have this chord progression. It is either preferable to gather the harmony in the basses to have the melody in the trebles, or the harmony in the trebles to have the bass a bit apart, instead of splitting this into 2 groups. Number 3. When you go from a chord to another, it's preferable to set different movements to the fifth and the root note of each chord. For instance, if the chord C major is followed by A minor, and I write them like this, you can see that the fifth and the root notes both go in the same direction, downward and by the same interval, so we say they are parallel. So parallel notes that are separated by an interval of fifth are often to avoid. But this of course depends a lot on the style of music you are writing in. In rock music, for instance, we often use power chords, which are only the root note and the fifth that are transposed in the same disposition all the time. So they are parallel fifth everywhere. But it is still something to keep in mind when you are writing an arrangement, as parallel fifths were the forbidden movement in classical music. So a good disposition for our C major and A minor could be this, which also follow the tip number 1 by continuing the note C. Number 4. If a note of your chords needs to be doubled, so if you have 4 voices playing a 3-note chord, for example, it is often advised not to double the fifth, because when you double a note in a chord, you emphasize its role. If you double the third, you will emphasize the fact that the chord is major or minor, which is the character, the color of the chord. This is often the best choice, but it depends a lot on your composition and what you want to push forward. If you double an extension, such as a 7th for example, you will emphasize the tension that this 7th creates, and this note will then need to be resolved as well. If you double the root note of the chord, you emphasize the very chord that you are playing, which is kind of the same thing that doubling the fifth, except doubling the root note is often better. Number 5. The bass plays a lot on how we hear a chord, so putting an extension note at the bass, like a 7th, a 9th or an 11th, is often to avoid. It is often better to put at the base the root note, the third or the fifth, as it is better to put a note that have a strong tonal role in this position. Overall, try to consider each note of your harmony as a separate voice, and try to avoid big gaps between notes so it is easier to sing each line. Because in a harmony that works well together, it's even better when it's made of lines that can work well on their own. And most of all, trust your ears. If you find something that sounds really good but defy the rules, maybe you should stick to it because your ears are your best allies. Embellishing tones are notes that are not part of the chord you're using, and they can be used to add variety or interest to your melodies. As these notes are not part of your harmony, they can add a bit of dissonance with the rest of your chords, and that can sometimes be a nice touch to add. But as they are dissonances, they are not always but often used on the weak beats. If they happen on a strong beat, it's said that they are accentuated. Anyway, depending on the context, these embellishing tones can wear different names. Number 1. Neighbor tone, or auxiliary tone. Neighbor tones are notes that will come from a note of your harmony, move up or down a tone next to it, and then resolve to the starting note that was part of your chord. For example, if we have this chord progression, if we add a neighbor tone to these notes and one on that one, it could be something like this. These notes are the neighbor tones. And these neighbor tones can also be double. Then you would have two extra notes, one above and one below, before going back to the original note. Number 2. Passing tone. A passing tone is the note that comes from a note of your chord, then move up or down a step and resolve by going in the same direction to another note of your chord. That can be the same chord as the first one or a different chord. For example, if we have this chord progression, we can add a passing tone between this note and this note by going up, and then between this note and this note by going down and down. You could also use more than one passing tone to go from one note to another. This is as well very close to the concept Jacob Collier uses to explain how he used microtonality in some of his compositions.
It's not like G and then the chord between F sharp and G and then F sharp F. It's more like you erase all idea of like notatable harmony and you just think I'm at G and my destination is E, so I go ba da 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 da. You divide it equally up, you know, or into more than like 5 da 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 da, you know. And if you can do that, all that matters is that you're aiming the place. All that matters is that you're arriving in a place. It doesn't matter how you get there.
Number 3. Escape tone. An escape tone is similar to the first two. It is a note that comes from a note of your chord and then move up or down a step and resolve by going in the opposite direction with a skip to another note that is part of your chord. For example, if we have this chord progression, we can add an escape tone between this note and this note by going up and then down, or between this note and this note by going down and then up, each time with a skip. Number 4. Anticipation and suspension. Anticipation and suspension occur when the harmony shifts from one chord to another, but all the notes of these chords don't change at the same time. If one note is played early, before the rest of the chord, it is an anticipation. And if one note is delayed and comes after the rest of the chord, that is a suspension. If you remember the sus2 and sus4 chords that we talked about like 2 episodes ago, I said that they were originally transition chords, and this is exactly when they can occur. Number 5. The appoggiatura. The appoggiatura is a bit like an unprepared neighbor tone. It is a non-chord tone, so a note that is not part of a chord, that resolves to a note of your chords by going up or down a step. This embellishing tone is usually, but not exclusively, on a strong beat. So when you want to add an appoggiatura to a note, you would start with the note just below or above it, before going to the note that is part of your chord. The time value of the appoggiatura is then subtracted from the time value of the principal note, which means that the appoggiatura delays the appearance of the principal note. For example, if I want to add an appoggiatura to this note, I could add this note at the beginning of it. If harmony is the way we organize notes in pitches, rhythm is the way we organize the notes in time. And this is not to confuse with tempo, which is the global pace of music. For example, a tempo of 100 beats per minute is different than a tempo of 140 beats per minute, but a rhythm, which is the grouping of several notes, can be played at any of these tempi. Now, to talk about rhythm, we'll have to define how we divide time and define the length each note can have and how we can notate that as well. So we start with the tempo that defines the speed of the music by telling us how many beats fits in 1 minute. So for 100 BPM, that's 100 beats per minute. That's the pace of our music. Then one of the biggest notes we can have is a whole note, which is 4 beats long. This is noted as a little circle. Then this whole note can be divided in 2 half notes, which are 2 beats long. It's noted with a little circle with a tail like this. Then, if we divide this note by 2 again, we have a quarter note, which lasts for 1 beat, and this one is noted as a black note with a tail. If we divide this one by 2, we have an 8th note, which lasts for a half beat, and is noted as a black note with a hook. Divided by 2, we have a 16th note, which is as long as the quarter of a beat, and is noted as a black note with 2 hooks. And then you can go on dividing the length of these notes again and again, dividing the length by 2 every time and adding a hook every time. So we have a whole note, which is the length of 2 half notes, each of them is the length of 2 quarter notes, etc, etc. And you also have equivalent symbols to write silences as well for each of these lengths. Here you can see them on this screen. We can then begin to combine all these notes and silences to create some rhythms. For example, if we take some of them at random, we could get this rhythm. Here the pulse given by our BPM would land there on these dots, and our rhythm will then sound like this. To have more variety, we can then add modifiers to these notes to modify the length a bit. First, you can link them so the length add up. So a half note, which is 2 beats, linked to a quarter note, which is 1 beat, would make a note that would last for 3 beats. Or a quarter note linked to a 16th note would make a note that would last for 1 beat plus the quarter of a beat. Secondly, you can also add a dot to a note. Basically, it extends the length of these notes by half of its original value. For example, a half note is 2 beats, but a dotted half note would be a half note plus the half of a half note. So it's the same length that a half note plus a quarter note, 3 beats. A dotted 8th note would be the same than an 8th note plus a 16th note, which would be 3/4 of a beat in total. And then a third way we can modify the time value of a note are tuplets. If we can divide the length of a note by 2 or by 4, tuplets are here to divide them by other odd numbers. They are noted as a group of notes linked by a bracket with a number above that indicates the ratio of the division. There are different kinds of tuplets. There are triplets that divide length into 3 equal parts. Triplets on quarter notes, for example, are 3 notes that will take the same length than 2 quarter notes. And triplets on 8th notes are 3 notes that will take the same length that 2 8th notes. Here is how these triplets sound like. Then there are quintuplets that are a way to divide the length in 5 equal parts, sextuplets divided by 6 and septuplet divided by 7. For example, quintuplets, sextuplets and septuplets on 8th notes are respectively 5, 6 and 7 notes that will take the same length than 4 8th notes. A quick note aside, most DAWs allow you to make triplets by editing the time grid, but that doesn't always allow you to make other tuplets. So I'll show you how I do them in my DAW of choice, Ableton Live, and hopefully it would work in a similar way in other DAWs. So for quintuplets, you put 6 notes, the 5 notes of the quintuplet plus 1 note, then select them all and squash them, so the 5 first notes fill the right amount of beats, and then you have a perfect quintuplet that you can then duplicate as you want. For sextuplet, you can use the triplet grid, as 6 is a multiple of 3. And for the septuplet, you put 8 notes, so the septuplet plus 1 note, then select them and squash them like before. So you can see the time of your song as divided in beats, which are all divided by 2, then subdivided by 2, as much as you want really. And that forms a grid that is really well represented by a piano roll of a door. And then you have these modifiers to modify the length of each note, to create notes with length that doesn't really fit with this grid, so you can make any rhythm you want. And so we now have all these notes to choose from to fill that grid. And we can pretty much create any rhythm pattern we like, really. Would there be a drum pattern, a melody, a harmonic rhythm, which is the rhythm with which your chords will change. And these rhythm patterns don't have to be all of the same length. They can be 3 beats long, 4 beats, 5 beats long, and the length of these rhythms will be determined by the type of bar we put this rhythm in, or rather by the time signature of this bar. Bars are like containers to put your notes in, and the length that will give us the core structure of our rhythm is given us by their time signature. The time signature is the numbers we sometimes see at the beginning of a bar, and that is presented like a fraction. These bars and time signatures will be the topic of the next video. In the last episode, we talked about different lengths notes can have, which is a way to divide time in sensible lengths so we can combine them to create rhythms. Then bars are like containers in which we can put these notes. And these bars are a good way to divide the song as well, especially because bars can be of different lengths, so they don't always contain the same number of beats. The way we tell how many beats fits in a bar is called a time signature. It appears in the form of 2 numbers at the beginning of a bar. The top number tells us how many notes fit in the bar, and the number below tells the nature of these notes. Most of the time it's a quarter or 8th note. Then all the bars after that will be of the same size until another time signature appears and tells otherwise. So a time signature of 4/4, for example, tells us that the bar is made of 4 quarter notes, so it's 4 beats long. This is the most common time signature in today's music, so common that it's sometimes written C instead of 4/4. But unlike some may think, this C doesn't stand for common, as this time signature hasn't always been the most used. And this all comes back from the Middle Age. To the Middle Age. Back in the Middle Age, around the 13th century, in Europe, the concept of bars didn't really exist. Though at this time we already had some symbols to write notes of different length, but the relative length of these notes would vary. Long story short, in the 14th century, the breve could be divided in either 2 or 3 subdivisions. If it was divided in 3 subdivisions, it was said that the tempus was perfect. And the tempus was imperfect if the breve was divided in 2 subdivisions. And then these subdivisions of the breve, called the semi-breves, could also be divided in either 2 or 3 subdivisions. In this case, we talked about major prollatio for 3 subdivisions and minor prollatio for 2 subdivisions. So you have these 4 possibilities. The tempus perfectus, where the beat is divided in 3, it was indicated at the beginning of the score by a circle, and the tempus imperfectus, where the beat is divided in 2, that was indicated by a half circle. Then, if the prollatio was major, a dot was added in the circle or the half circle. And that is where the C comes from. Originally, it's not a C, it's a half circle. That means tempus imperfectus prollatio minor, in which every beat is divided in 2 subdivisions that are also divided in 2 subdivisions. Just like our 4/4 that became the most used time signature. This is a very short version of how it worked back then, and maybe someday I will make some episode on how European music evolved in this part of the Middle Age and how France kind of rocked this game in terms of innovation at that time, but for now, there you go. Coming back from the Middle Age. Now, let's have a look at some different time signatures. We already talked about the 4/4, where a bar is made of 4 beats. Usually, the first and the third beats are considered strong beats, with the first one being the strongest. So the beats 2 and 4 are considered the weak beats. As a basic drum pattern, to highlight that, we often find a kick drum on the first beat and a snare on either the 2 and 4 or on the third beat. With a time signature of 3/4, the bar would be filled with 3 quarter notes. So the bar would be made of 3 beats, with the strong beat being on the 1 and the beat 2 and 3 being weak beats. A bar with a time signature of 6/8 would also be 3 beats long, because there would be 6/8 notes, so that's the same length that 3 quarter notes. But the 8 as a denominator is a hint that the strong and weak beats cannot be divided in quarter notes. In fact, in 6/8, the strong beats would be on the first and fourth 8th note, the first one being the strongest. So it's like a 2-beat bar with each beat being divided in 3 subdivisions. Here is what it sounds like compared to a 3/4 measure. The 4/4 and the 3/4 are called simple time signature. It means that the beat is divided into simple notes. Here the beat falls on every quarter note. The 6/8, however, is called a compound time signature because the beat is divided into dotted notes. Here the beat hits every dotted quarter note. Another example of compound time signature can be 9/8. Here the bar contains 9/8 notes. A common way to divide that bar would be to put the strong beats on the 1st, the 4th and the 7th note, so it sounds like this. There, with these time signatures, we covered the equivalent of all tempus from the 14th centuries we saw earlier. The 4/4 would be the equivalent of tempus imperfectus prollatio minor, where the long notes are divided in 2 and these subdivisions are also divided in 2. The 3/4 would be the equivalent of the tempus perfectus prollatio minor, where the long notes are divided in 3 and the subdivisions are divided in 2. The 6/8 would be the equivalent of the tempus imperfectus prollatio major, where the long notes are divided in 2 and the subdivisions are divided in 3. And finally, the 9/8, the least common of the 4, would be the equivalent of the tempus perfectus prollatio major, where the long notes are divided in 3 and these subdivisions are also divided in 3. Among these 4, it's interesting to see the most used time division from the Middle Age became the least used time signature today. But this modern time signature system allows us to create more types of time signatures to make bars of 5 or 7 beats, for example. This would make some time signatures like 5/4 and 7/4 or 5/8 and 7/8. These kind of time signatures are called asymmetric meters because they are not made of groupings of 2 or 3 notes, but a mixture of the two. The 5/8, for instance, can be counted either like a group of 2 8th notes plus a group of 3, or a group of 3 8th notes plus a group of 2. In the first case, the accents, the strong beats, would fall on the 1st and 3rd notes, and in the second case, it would fall on the 1st and 4th note. For a bar of 5/4, it would work in the exact same way, but with quarter notes instead of 8th note. For a time signature of 7/8, it would work with the same groupings of 2 and 3 notes, so it can be either 2 plus 2 plus 3, or 2 plus 3 plus 2, or 3 plus 2 plus 2. In the first example, the strong beats would fall on the 1st, the 3rd and the 5th notes. In the second example, they would fall on the 1st, the 3rd and the 6th note, and in the third example, the accents would be on the 1st, the 4th and the 6th note. For a 7/4 time signature, it would be the exact same thing, but with quarter note instead of 8th note again. And it works the exact same way with a time signature of 9/8 we just saw earlier. With groupings of 2 and 3 notes, we can have all these different combinations. With all of this, you could make your own time signature with simple, compound and asymmetric methods. You can even use several of them in one song, as a song doesn't need to use only one time signature all the way, and each one have its own character and its own vibe. Knowing how to identify where are the strong beats or accents should help you to get used to them. This being said, don't hesitate to move these accents around. I'm giving them as a guideline, but there are a lot of examples of music putting the accents on different beats. But for now, we still haven't talked about polyrhythms, and that's something I would like to tackle in the next episode of this series. Polyrhythm is the superposition of two rhythms that don't have the same number of beats, but are of the same duration. For example, in a bar of 4/4, which is 4 beats long, you could have 3 triplets half notes over 4 quarter notes. Then you have a polyrhythm of 3/4. The same duration, the bar of 4/4, is divided in 3 by the triplets and by 4 by the quarter notes. Here is what it sounds like. In the same way, you could make other polyrhythms, like 5/4 or 7/5 for instance. As long as the two rhythms that are layered fill the same amount of time, usually 1 bar, it will be a polyrhythm. If I talk about polyrhythms, I also have to talk about polymeter. A polymeter is the superposition of two time signatures that don't have the same number of beats per bar, so their bars would be of different length. Combining two rhythms that are not of the same length will mean that the more their patterns repeat, the more offset they'll become, even though each of their subdivisions can be of the same duration. Let's have a look at this to see what I mean. This is a 3/4 over 4/4 polymeter. We'll have a bar of 3/4, so we'll play the first note and leave the two others silent. That will be our pattern that will then be repeated. That will make 1 E A, 2 E A, 3 E A, 4 E A. And with the bar of 4/4, we'll play the first one and leave the three others silent. That will make 1 E and the 2 E and the 3 E and the. So now if we layer these bars on top of each other, every quarter note will be of the same length and both rhythms will start on the same beat. But as you can see, the hits offset over time. Because it's a 3/4 over 4/4 polymeter, the two patterns will resynchronize again after 3 loops of the 4/4 patterns or 4 loops of the 3/4 patterns. And this polymeter will play like this. You can notice how this polymeter of 3/4 over 4/4 is similar to the polyrhythm of 3/4. They sound identical but at different speeds. And that is because their ratio is the same, it's 3:4, and that's probably the most important part, but we'll get back to it. So to sum it up, a polyrhythm is one length of time, usually a bar, divided in two different ways, so the notes won't have the same length in the two rhythms. And a polymeter is two rhythms built around the same type of notes, so the total length of the two rhythms are different. So you can play this polymeter as is, having these hits played with different notes, by different instruments or with different drum sounds, but you can also create rhythm a bit more complex for each layer to see how they combine. And that's where knowing where are the strong and weak beats of each time signature can be handy, as it gives you a good base to start with. Again, this is all explained in the previous video about time signatures. But keep in mind that the ratio is everything. The simpler the ratio is between two meters, the easier the polyrhythm or polymeter is to internalize. If the ratio between the two meters is very complex, like let's say 9/15, the polyrhythm will be more difficult to understand quickly. If it kind of reminds you the very first video of this series about consonances and dissonances, you're right. Combining rhythms kind of works like combining tones, where the simpler the ratio is between two frequencies, the more consonant they are. If you want to learn more about the relationship between rhythm and pitches, you can watch Adam Neely's conference about it on Ableton channels. It's a 45-minute video talking about how polyrhythms and chords can be related, and then explain a few things beyond that point. It's very interesting. I'll leave a link in the description. So the simplest ratio you can have between two rhythms is 2/3, where an amount of time is divided in 2 in the first rhythm and divided in 3 in the second rhythm. This particular polyrhythm is called an hemiola, and you can obtain it by combining a bar of 3/4 and a bar of 6/8. The bar of 3/4 is divided in 3 beats that can each be divided in 2, which gives us this 1 and 2 and 3 end. And the bar of 6/8 is made of 2 groupings of 3 notes, which gives us this 1E and 2E end. So see how we have this pattern of 2 repeating 3 times and this pattern of 3 repeated twice. The Emiola is kind of special because it is a polyrhythm, the same bar divided in 2 ways, in 2 and in 3 beats. But at the same time, it's also a polymeter, as it is 2 times signatures combined, where all the subdivisions are of the same length. So let's hear how the Emiola sounds like. I'll play both rhythms with bell notes. The rhythm of 2 will be these 2 notes. And for the rhythm of 3, I will play these notes. The simplicity of this polyrhythm makes it super effective, and it has been used in countless musics and genres, from sub-Saharan African music to Renaissance pieces. Quick note aside about the relation between pitch and rhythm. The term Emiola was also used by early Pythagoreans to talk about the perfect fifth, describing the ratio of 2 lengths of 2 strings being 3:2. The shortest string would then make 3 vibrations in the same amount of time that the longest string makes 2, producing a perfect fifth. And that is the kind of thing we talked about in the very first video of this series. If you want to see more about how to use the Emiola, I will also leave another link in the description. It is for a video of Jay Clisio from Signals Music Studio, where he uses the Emiola for a composition. Okay, just before we wrap up this video, let's make a last polymeter of 7/4 over 4/4. So the 2 rhythms will offset in the way that it will take 7 loops of 4/4 bars or 4 loops of 7/4 bars for these 2 meters to resynchronize. If we write the first note of each bar, we end up with something like this. So we can see how these meters layer. Let's see how it goes. If the length of this whole part was 1 bar, this would make a polyrhythm of 7/4, as there would be 7 beats over 4 beats. Which means that if you can speed that up and internalize it well, writing a polymeter is a good way to learn its corresponding polyrhythm. And again, the simpler the ratio is between 2 rhythms, the simpler it is to learn, as the loop will be shorter. Anyway, so we have this polymeter of 7/4 over 4/4. Let's see how it sounds with a bit more complex rhythms. I'll play the kick and the snare on the first and the third beats of each bar of 4/4. Then I'll divide the bar of 7/4 in 2, so it's more of 2 bars of 7/8, and I'll play open hi-hats on the 1, the 3 and the 5, and close hi-hats on the 2, the 4, the 6 and the 7. There have been 18 episodes before this one, and we have talked about a lot of things. Actually, we may have talked about pretty much everything I wanted to talk about when I started this series. And of all the things, I feel like sometimes it can be difficult to see how they all combine and how it is all connected. So today I'd like to sum up a lot of things we saw in this series and try to show how they relate, and then put everything on one page that can make a useful document for composing. To begin, everything on this document will be based on the key of C. That's probably the easiest, because everything seems to be based on the C major scale, and it's easy to visualize on a piano keyboard as it is all the white keys. But to help you use other tonalities, there will be other pages for these other tonalities. So at the top of the first page, let's start with a reminder of all the intervals of the scale. If you know the root note of your tonality is C, you can see the function of all the other notes with their corresponding intervals in this table. For example, if the root note is C, a E would be a major third, because it is 2 whole tones above C. And 4 whole tones above the root note could be either an augmented 5th or a minor 6th, depending if you consider it a G, the 5th note of the scale, or a A, the 6th note of the scale. So in the same way, you could find all the other intervals you might need, up to the 13th. Under that, let's put the C major scale. If you wonder how major and minor scales are built, it is all explained in the 4th episode about scales and modes. So then we can add a list of all the chords of all the degrees of the major scale. From the 1st degree to the 7th degree, that's major, minor, minor, major, major, minor, and diminished. So the 1st degree of the C major scale is the C major chord, the 2nd degree would be a D minor chord, the 3rd degree would be a E minor chord, etc. This gives you all the chords you can use within the C major scale. And if you want to use another major scale, you can replace these notes by the notes of this other major scale. So it would be all in the tonality you're using. The type of chords for each degree won't change. But as I said earlier, there will be other pages to help you use other tonalities. To know how to build major, minor, diminished or augmented chords, it is all explained in the episode about triads. In the last row, I will also add the 7th chord for each degree. So if you want to use 7th chord for your song, you could know what type of 7th chord you could use for every degree. So the 1st degree would be a C major 7th chord, the 2nd degree would be a D minor 7th chord, etc. We saw how to build those in the episode about 7th chords. It's also in this episode that we talked about all the intervals that you have at the top of the page. Okay, so under that, let's add the same table for minor scales: natural, harmonic and melodic. So if you're using a C minor scale, you can use these instead. It's worth noting that the harmonic minor scale is a bit special, as it contains a different type of 7th chord on each degree. From the 1st degree to the 7th degree, that goes minor major 7th, half diminished 7th, augmented, minor 7th, dominant 7th, major 7th, and diminished 7th. To know how these natural, harmonic and melodic minor scales are built, it is in the episodes about dominant chords. But just so it's said here, the difference between the harmonic minor and the natural minor is that the 7th note of the harmonic minor scale is raised by a semitone compared to the natural minor scale. And the melodic minor scale have both the 6th and 7th notes raised by a semitone compared to the natural minor scale. Actually, the melodic minor scale is just like the major scale, but with a 3rd that is minor. You could use the 3 minor scales in one composition, as they are very close to one another, and they are basically 3 variations of the same scale. Now, to use these chords more easily, you have a list of different cadences here. Cadences are like recognizable chord progressions that are really useful. It's like the punctuation in a sentence. So first you have the authentic cadence that goes from a 5th degree to a 1st degree, often prepared by a 2 or a 4, and the plagal cadence that goes from a 4th degree to a 1st degree, which are both conclusive cadences that reinforce the tonality you are in. Then you have a half cadence that finishes a musical sentence on the 5th degree. It often goes from the 1st degree to the 5th degree, and that is like a question that needs to be answered. And then the deceptive cadence that begins like an authentic cadence but then at the last minute goes to another degree instead of the 1. It often goes for the 6th. More details on those on the episodes about cadences. Then let's add some more exotic cadences that can be useful. We can add the tritone substitution, which replaces the degree 5 in an authentic cadence by a flat 2, so it goes from flat 2 to 1, and this flat 2 is often a major chord or a dominant 7th chord. You can see it in the episode about borrowings and substitutions. We can also add the Napolitan 6th, which is very similar. It is also a flat 2, but that replaces a chord of the 2nd or 4th degree, a subdominant chord. So it's often seen before an authentic cadence. Then we can add the Faurean cadence, which is like a half cadence that is prepared by a 4th degree in its dominant 7th form. You can see these two last chord progression in the first episode about special chords. And lastly, there is the Andalusian cadence, which is not really a cadence. It's more of a chord progression that is supposed to be played in loop, but just in case you'd like to try it as a regular cadence, here it is. To have more details on the Andalusian cadence, you'll find it in the 2nd episode about special chords and chord progressions. If I ever talk about other cadences in the future, I will update this document as well. So if you're watching this in the future and you see that other cadences have been added, you'll surely find an episode explaining it in the playlist of Music Theory in 5 minutes. Now, at some point in your composition, you may want to modulate to another tonality. To help you do that, you have here a circle of fifths. With this, you can know all the notes of every major and natural minor scales, and you can see what tonalities are close to the one you're using. In the C major scale, that is at the top, all the notes are natural, and it's the same for the A natural minor scale, which is its relative. Then every step you go clockwise adds a sharp note in the scale. These sharp notes always appears in the same order, which is written here. F, then C, then G, D, A, E, and B. And then every step you take anti-clockwise adds a flat note in the scale, and this flat note appears in the opposite order. First the B, then the E, then A, D, G, C, F. So for example, in F major, this is one step anti-clockwise, so it has one flat note, and this note is B, because it's the first flat note to appear. So the scale of F major would be F, G, A, B flat, C, D, E. And then you can use this table from earlier to know that the first degree, the F chord, would be a major chord or a major seventh chord. The second degree, the G chord, would be a minor chord or a minor seventh chord, etc. And if you take D minor, it's the same. It's one step anti-clockwise. So it's one flat note, that is B flat, and the scale is D, E, F, G, A, B flat, C. You can then use these notes in the table of the natural minor scale to know what kind of chord is on each degree. And from there you can find the notes for the harmonics and melodic minor scales that you can put in their respective tables if you want to use them. There are a lot of things that you can do with the circle of fifth, and you can have more details about that on the episode dedicated to it. So you can also use this circle of fifth to know what is the dominant chord of each chord and use that to switch from a tonality to another. For example, a D chord is good to go to a tonality of G, a G chord is good to go to a tonality of C, a C chord is good to go to a tonality of F, etc. You can see more on how to use this in the episode about modulations. Another thing to add to this page are modes: Ionian, Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian, Aeolian and Locrian, with the corresponding series of intervals that build each one next to them. One mnemonic sentence to remember the order of these modes can be "I don't punch like Muhammad Ali." I thought that might be useful, so there it is. Once again, I've put all them as C scales, so I thought they would be more useful to compare them. So this is C Ionian, which is the C major scale, then C Dorian, C Phrygian, C Lydian, C Mixolydian, C Aeolian, which is the C natural minor scale, and C Locrian. If you want to learn more about modes and how it is all built, it is in the episode about scales and modes that should already be listed in this little eye at the top. One last thing I would like to add to this page is a table of secondary dominants. At any point in your composition, you can add the fifth degree of any chord and then go to that chord. That's a secondary dominant. And that's a good way to add notes that are not originally in the scale you're using. So on the first line are the chords of the C major scale, and on the second line are the fifth degrees of each of those chords. So you could use a A7 chord to go to a D chord or a C7 chord to go to a F chord, for example. The four next lines are the four notes that build these secondary dominant chords: the tonic, the third, the fifth and the seventh. See, if you're using an A7 chord to go to a D chord, for example, the A7 chord would be made of A, C sharp, E and G. So you will be using a C sharp that is normally not in the C major scale. As a bonus, I also added a chart of different types of chords you could substitute for a fifth degree. Here is the dominant seventh chord, the type of chord we normally use with a fifth degree in a cadence, with the example of a G seventh chord, which is the fifth degree in the C major scale. That will use the notes G, B, D and F, so it doesn't use any notes external to the C major scale. Now you could substitute any of these other chords for this G7 chord. For example, a G diminished seventh chord would use a B flat and a D flat, which are external to the C major scale. If you want more details about that, it is in the episode about borrowings and substitutions. And that will wrap up this first page. I know that may be a lot of information if you're discovering it for the first time, but everything should be explained in the series of episodes. I had some feedback saying that this format of 5 minutes per videos can be a bit fast for people who are new to music theory, so you might want to rewind sometimes. But if anything is still unclear and if you have any question, don't hesitate to ask them in the comment sections. There is no dumb question and I would be happy to help. The 11 following pages are essentially the same, but based on different root notes. So you wouldn't have to transpose this whole page to any tonality, they are all already done. So the next page will be all about rhythm. First, let's put the equivalence of different notations of a whole note being divided in half notes that are divided in quarter notes, etc. I'm not sure if that's really useful once you know it, but that kind of looks cool. And we can put the same diagram with the equivalent symbols for silences. Then we can break down all the ways we could divide one beat into 16th notes. I'm actually using a system of squares that are filled or empty, so this would look like the MIDI blocks in your DAW. And there could be any type of notes, like quarter notes, 8th note or 16th note, for example. We can then number them, so we could easily create rhythm by picking numbers at random. This can make good building blocks to come up with some hopefully interesting rhythms. Let's also do it with triplets, so we would have both binary and ternary rhythms. More details on how we can divide time in the first episode about rhythm. Now, to use these notes and rhythms in a more diverse way, we can write down different time signatures with an indication of where are the strong beats in each one. The strong beats are the round notes and the weak beats are the crosses. These are just indications of where we put the strong beats most of the time. This is by no means a prescription of what you should do all the time. But the main principle here is that you can divide these time signatures into groupings of 2 or 3 notes, and the first note of each grouping then becomes a strong beat. You can have more information about time signatures in its dedicated episode here. The last pages of this document are kind of annexes. Here I listed a lot of different scales that you can try if you want to change from the major or minor scales, and they are all listed by modes. So for example, this first table starts with the harmonic minor scales here on the first row, and then the second row is its second mode, meaning that it's a scale that uses the exact same notes but starting on the second note. Then the third row is the third mode, with the same notes but starting on the third note. The fourth row is the fourth mode, etc. Then I transposed all these scales to a key of C, so they all begin with the same note, and I guess it would be easier to compare them or to find a scale in particular if you know what notes you want to use. I did this for a lot of different scales, so you would have a lot of scales to play with, but as you can see, for some of them I didn't find any corresponding name. These documents may be updated in the future, so if you know the name of any of these missing scales, or if you'd like to see other elements on this document, you can tell me in the comments. These last pages are kind of a bonus, as we didn't really see these modes in particular in the series, but there you have them so you can try them. If you're still not sure about modes, you can watch the episode about scales and modes that is already listed in the description. These are built with the same principles. I didn't include the chords for each degree for each of these scales, as I wanted to limit the visual cluster on these pages. But if you want to know how to find all the chords that will go with each of these scales, the episode about triads can help you do that. Music theory is like a cookbook. It's full of recipes you can follow as is, and it will make great dishes. But you can also take these techniques as an inspiration and apply them in another way to make something of your own. And people have been making amazing dishes long before the cookbook exists. So there are some cases where some music used things that just didn't fit with our Occidental music theory concepts, and other cases where techniques from these Western cookbooks were used in an odd way to create something new. Today we'll talk about pentatonic scales. A pentatonic scale is a scale that is made of 5 notes, penta meaning 5. Most of the time when we talk about a pentatonic scale, we talk about a scale of 5 notes that is derived from a regular heptatonic scale, a scale of 7 notes, in a way that some notes are removed to avoid intervals of a semitone. For example, the C pentatonic major scale is derived from the regular major scale of C. Only the F and the B are removed, so we avoid the interval of one semitone between E and F. Here we keep the E to keep the third of the C major chord. And between B and C, here we keep the C to keep the tonic of the scale. And as A minor is the relative of C major, the pentatonic minor scale of A will use the same notes but only starting on the A. Actually, we could write down all the modes of these pentatonic scales for future reference. I'll add them to my big music theory cheat sheet that you can download for free with a link in the description. For more detail about this document, I made a video explaining it. So these pentatonic scales are very handy, and because they don't contain any semitone interval, it's fairly hard to get something dissonant with them. For example, they are great if you are using a modular setup that triggers notes randomly. Notes would be played randomly, but there shouldn't be much friction between them. These scales are also used a lot for soloing in rock or blues music among others, but we'll get back to that later. If you want to experiment with a pentatonic scale, you can try to use only the black keys on your keyboard. That would be using the F-sharp pentatonic major scale or the D-sharp pentatonic minor scale. So this is one way we could look at pentatonic scales through the scope of our Western music theory, where we just take some of our scales and remove some notes to avoid steps of a semitone. But pentatonic scales have been used for ages in a lot of different cultures that used totally different paradigms, and this is a great way to remind us that our Occidental music theory is not the only way to make music. It's only one system among others. It is, I guess, the most used around the world, so much so that these other cultures tend to adopt Occidental scales and instruments, because it allows us to play all together and because, well, mainly because of colonization. For example, some pre-Columbian scales divided the octave in 5 equal intervals, so this made a scale of 5 notes, so that's still pentatonic. But these notes didn't really line up with the notes used in Occidental scales. This was simply not compatible with our Western music theory. So under the influence of the Spanish, instrument makers there adopted the Occidental scales to make their instruments, making their traditional songs sound slightly out of tune, but allowing them to play Occidental music as well. But making other cultures' music down to only the use of scales would be rather reductive. There are often a lot more theoretical and even spiritual concepts attached to that. For example, if we look up the modes of our pentatonic scales from earlier, we can find alternative names for most of them. For example, Raga Bhopali, Raga Madhyamavati, Raga Devakriya, etc. These ragas come from Indian classical music, and they are way more than just scales. They have actually no direct translation to concepts in the European classical music tradition. A raga is more like a combination of a scale, not necessarily of 5 notes by the way, with musical structures and motifs that can be combined and reordered by the musician who is improvising with it. Ragas are considered to have the ability to color the minds of the audience, so traditionally each raga have emotional and symbolic associations attached to it. And there are several hundreds of them, and these raga don't always use intervals that match the Western music scales as well. All these to say 2 things. Pentatonic scales are awesome, they are easy to use and you can use them in many ways, and they are present in a lot of cultures. And some musical concepts from other cultures are not always compatible with our Occidental music theory, even though some cultures have adopted some of our Western concepts. But sometimes it is our music theory that evolves to implement something new. And that's what we'll see in the next episode of this series, where we will talk about blues scales. Here is the blues minor scale of A. It's made of A, C, D, E flat, E and G. Apart from the fact it sounds awesome, it is also just like a minor pentatonic scale, but with this diminished fifth added. This added note is a note we call blue note. But where does this come from? It makes more sense to look at the major blues scales to find that out. The relative major of A minor is C major, so the C major blues scales would use the same notes but starting from C. So that's C, D, E flat, E, G, A. Seen like this, the blues scale is like a pentatonic major scale, but with a minor third added, so it has both a minor and a major third. And this is exactly how this extra note was introduced in the scale, as a minor third. See, you can use a major pentatonic over a major tonality of the same name, like C major pentatonic over a song written in C major for instance. All the notes are in common, so it will work. You can use a minor pentatonic over a minor tonality of the same name, like C minor pentatonic over a song written in C minor, for instance. All the notes are in common, so it will also work. But you can also use some elements of the minor pentatonic over the major tonality of the same name, like using some notes of the C minor pentatonic over a song in C major, for instance. It's not as intuitive, but that's what a lot of early bluesmen did. Because when a major chord is playing and you play a minor third over it, it creates a friction between the minor third and the major third that are then coexisting. And then this minor third wants to go up to the major third of the chord to be resolved. So you can use this E flat as a bridge to go to a E, or use this B flat to go to a B. These notes that are specific to the minor scale are better used as transitions to go toward a note that is part of the major scale that is used for the song. If you finish a melodic line on a note that is not part of this major scale, it will not be as effective, as you will then finish on a dissonance that is not resolved. But using these dissonances as transitions has this particular blues color to it, which is really nice. Another way to use this dissonance between a minor third and a major third of a chord is by using a dominant 7 sharp 9 type of chord. This is a regular dominant 7th chord made of a root note, a major third, a perfect 5th and a minor 7th, to which we add an augmented 9th. Just like a regular dominant 7th chord, this type of chord is often used on the 5th degree of a scale. So if we are in C major, it could be seen on its 5th degree, G. And our G dominant 7th sharp 9 chord would be made of the root note G, its major third B, its perfect 5th D, its minor 7th F, and the 9th should be A, but we need a sharp 9, so we raise that by a semitone, which gives us a B flat. As you can see, we have then in this chord a major third B and a B flat, which is equal to a minor third. This chord is dissonant, but it works because these 2/3 are spread out on 2 separate octaves. Because it is used on a 5th degree, this G7 sharp 9 chord would resolve well on a C chord, which is our 1st degree. So we have a nice 5-to-1 authentic cadence. This dominant 7 sharp 9 chord is also called the Jimi Hendrix chord, because it's a chord that he loved and that he helped popularize notably with his song Purple Haze. The chord progression of this song cycles between the chords E7 sharp 9, G and A. Here is the E7 sharp 9, which can be considered as our degree 5, with the notes E, G sharp, B, D and F double sharp, which is like a G natural. Then there is the G chord, which uses notes already in the E7 sharp 9 chord, the G, the B and the D. and then it goes to the A chord, which is the first degree chord, that resolves well after the E7 sharp 9 chord. So when you play over a major tonality, you can use a major pentatonic, but you can also use notes from the minor pentatonic. So if you mix the major pentatonic and the minor pentatonic together to make it only one scale, for the tonality of C for example, this would make this scale: C, D, E flat, E, F, G, A, B flat. You can use this scale as is, but it could be tricky to use sometimes, as the risk of friction would necessarily increase. So the blues scale is a simplified version of that, where we take the major pentatonic and we add only the third of the minor pentatonic scale. This makes it easier to use because then we only have to be careful of this one note, and we still have access to this blues flavor given by this little chromatic bit introduced by the introduction of this minor third. This gives us the major blues scale. And if we take the relative minor of this scale, which would be the scale using the same notes but starting from A, we have now the minor blues scale. And this is how we end up with a blues scale that looks like a minor pentatonic, but with a diminished fifth added. This E flat that have been added is 3 tones above the root note, which is an interval of a diminished fifth. This is something that is the result of ages of evolution, and the precise origin of this scale is unclear, but it is the result of repetitive use of unorthodox methods that created these scales. And it is one of the most used in rock, blues or jazz. It is one of the first one a beginner guitarist would learn for improvisation, because it works on anything. And the morality I'd like to take out of that is that if music is a language, there's always a way we can communicate, even though we use it in a different way or in an unorthodox way, and we are also able to make up our own slang or dialects that maybe someday will find its way into the dictionary. As you probably already know, to build a chord, you basically take the notes of the scale you want to use, start with the notes you want to build a chord from, that's the note that will give the chord its name, and then follow the notes of the scale, keeping one note every 2. If you keep 3 notes, you have a triad, which is made of a tonic, a third and a fifth. I'll leave a link in the description to the episode that talks about triads. If you keep 4 notes, you have a 7th chord, which is made of a tonic, a third, a fifth and a 7th. I will also leave a link in the description to the episode that talks about 7th chord. And if you keep 5 notes, then you have a 9th chord, which is made of a tonic, a third, a fifth, a 7th and a 9th. Then the nature of this 9th chord depends on the interval separating each note, and that is what we'll see now. There are many types of 9th chords, so we'll start with the most commonly used and then finish with the more rare ones. But just before we begin, I'd like to make 3 notes. First, one thing to keep in mind is that the more extension notes you add above the triad, the more color the chord has, but also the more tension you add, so generally these 7th and 9th notes needs to be resolved in one way or another. Second, this 9th note is actually the same note than the second, but 1 octave higher. So it can introduce friction with the tonic and the third, as these notes are very close. To attenuate this friction, it is often advised to keep the 9th an octave higher, so it sounds smoother by letting the chord breathe. But there is no particular rule for that, so you do as you want really. And third, when you don't play the 7th of a chord, so you only have a triad with a 9th, we call that add 9. And generally this 9th is a major 9th. So we can have, for example, a C minor add 9, which is a C minor chord plus a major 9th. Or we can have, for example, a C add 9, which is a C major chord with a major 9th added. You'll see in a minute how you can use these chords, as there are only variations of other 9th chord I have on my list. So the first type of 9th chord we're gonna see is the dominant 9th, which is simply noted as 9. It is made of a major triad with a minor 7th, so that's a dominant 7th chord, to which we add a major 9th. So for a C chord that would be C, the major 3rd E, the perfect 5th G, the minor 7th B flat and the major 9th D. This type of chord is often used as a dominant chord on the 5th degree of your tonality, so that would resolve well on a 1st degree for instance. So in C major, for example, the 5th degree would be G, so the progression would be G dominant 9th to a C major chord. And in A minor, a 5-to-1 progression would make E dominant 9th to a minor chord. It is also a common practice to omit the 5th in a dominant 9th chord, so you would have only the tonic, the 3rd, the 7th and the 9th. Now, to add more tension to this dominant 9th chord, you could alter it by lowering its 9th by a semitone. So the chord would be made by the same dominant 7th chord, but with a minor 9th added. This type of chord would be noted 7 flat 9. So for a C chord, it would be made of the root note C, the major third E, the perfect fifth G, the minor seventh B flat, and the minor ninth D flat. And it would be used and resolved in the exact same way than the dominant ninth chord. So in the tonality of C major, that would make G7 flat 9 to a C major chord. And in a tonality of A minor, that would make E7 flat 9 to A minor. You could also alter the dominant ninth chord the other way around by moving the ninth upper semitone instead of down. That would make a 7th sharp ninth chord, which is built with a dominant 7th chord to which we add an augmented ninth. This chord is also known as the Hendrix chord, as it was made popular by Jimi Hendrix. We saw that in the episode about blues scale. So for a C chord, it would be made of the root note C, the major third E, the perfect fifth G, the minor seventh B flat, and the augmented ninth D sharp. And again, it is used and resolved just like a dominant ninth chord. So in C major, that would make G7 sharp 9 to C major. And in A minor, that would make E7 sharp 9 to A minor. To sum it up, you can use a dominant 7th chord on the 5th degree on your tonality, to which you add either a major ninth, a minor ninth, or an augmented ninth, depending on the color you want to add to your chord progression. And that works well in either a major or minor tonality. Then you have a major ninth chord, which is made of a major triad with a major 7th and a major ninth. So that's a major 7th chord to which we add a major ninth. On a C chord, that would be made of the root note C, the major third E, the perfect fifth G, the major 7th B, and the major ninth D. This is a type of chord you can use on the 1st degree or the 4th degree in a major tonality, but you can also use it on the 3rd and 6th degree of a minor tonality. Using the major 9th chord on these degrees would work better because it would use only the notes already in the scale you're using. So in the tonality of C major, that would mean using a F major 9th for the 4th degree or a C major 9th for the 1st degree. As an example, we can try a chord progression that goes from 1 to 4 and then 4 to 1. Or in the tonality of A minor, we can use a C major 9th chord on the 3rd degree or a F major 9th chord on the 6th degree, for example. So you could make this chord progression. The chord we commonly name minor ninth actually contains a major ninth. The minor ninth chord is made of the minor triad with a minor 7th and a major ninth. So it's like a minor 7th chord with a major ninth added. So on a C chord, that would be made of the root note C, the minor third E flat, the perfect fifth G, the minor 7th B flat, and the major ninth D. That's a type of chord you can find in a major tonality on the 2nd degree and on the 6th degree, as building a 9th chord on these degrees using only the notes of a major scale would make a minor 9th chord, and in a minor tonality, this type of chord can be found on the 1st and 4th degrees. So in the tonality of C major, the 6th and the 2nd degree would be A minor and D minor. This type of chord seems to be a bit more efficient on a 2nd degree just before a 5th degree chord. So that would prepare a nice 2-5-1 chord progression if you want to resolve that progression totally. So we could make this chord progression. And in the tonality of A minor, for instance, the 4th and the 1st degree would be also a D minor and an A minor, which can go well together. Now we could have a minor triad with a minor 7th and a minor 9th. This type of chord would be noted as minor 7th, minor 9th. For a C chord, for example, that would be made of the root note C, the minor 3rd E flat, the perfect 5th G, the minor 7th B flat, and the minor 9th D flat. This is a type of chord you can find in a major tonality on the 3rd degree and in a minor tonality on the 5th degree. But it is less common in a minor tonality because for a 5th degree chord, a dominant 9th chord is often preferred. So in the tonality of C major, for example, the 3rd degree would be E minor. So we could make that a E minor 7th minor 9th chord. Then we can have a ninth chord built with a diminished triad, with a minor seventh and a minor ninth. So it's like a half diminished seventh chord to which we add a minor ninth. I personally like to call this type of chord half diminished ninth, but it is often called simply diminished ninth, which I find a bit confusing. So to avoid confusion, we can call it a half diminished seventh minor ninth, with this cross circle that means half diminished. Anyway, on a C chord there would be the root note C, the minor third E flat, the diminished fifth G flat, the minor seventh B flat, and the minor ninth D flat. That's a type of chord you could find in a major tonality on the 7th degree, for instance, and in a minor tonality on the 2nd degree. But it is more used in minor tonalities, as the 7th degree in a major tonality can be analyzed as a 5th degree without the root note. The tension it brings to the chord progression is very similar. So let's see how it sounds in a minor tonality on the 2nd degree. In A minor, the 2nd degree would be B. So a B half diminished ninth would be made of the notes B, D, F, A, and C. So that's a lot of different ninth chords already and a lot of options to choose from. But almost all these chords can already be found in a major or minor tonality, as they only use the notes from the major and the natural minor scales. Now we are going to see some types of ninth chord that can be a bit trickier to use, and they use notes that are outside of the major and the natural minor scales. But most of these more rare ninth chords can actually be found in the harmonic minor scale. So more options to explore, but maybe a bit trickier to use. You can have what I like to call a fully diminished ninth chord. It is made of a diminished triad, a diminished seventh, and a minor ninth. So that's like a diminished seventh chord to which we add a minor ninth. To avoid confusion with the previous half diminished seventh minor ninth chord, that is sometimes just called diminished ninth, we can call this one diminished seventh minor ninth. So for a C chord, that would be the root note C, the minor third E flat, the diminished fifth G flat, the diminished seventh B double flat, which is the same note than an A, and the minor ninth D flat. That is a very dissonant chord, as it contains two intervals of a tritone and an interval of a minor second. This is a type of chord that is sometimes used in a minor tonality on the 7th degree. So in the tonality of A minor, there would be a G sharp diminished 7th minor ninth. The augmented ninth chord is made of a major triad with a major 7th and an augmented ninth. That can be noted +9 or augmented ninth. So for a C augmented ninth chord, that would be the root note C, the major third E, the perfect fifth G, the major 7th B, and the augmented ninth D sharp. That's a type of chord that is more often used in a minor tonality on the 6th degree. So in A minor, the 6th degree would be F, and we could have this chord progression. You could also have an augmented triad with a major 7th and a major 9th. That would be noted +7th, major 9th. So for a C +7 major 9th chord, that would be the root note C with the major 3rd E, the augmented 5th G sharp, the major 7th B, and the major 9th D. This is a type of chord you could find on the 3rd degree in a minor tonality. So this C +7 major 9th chord could be the 3rd degree in the tonality of A minor. And finally, you could have a minor triad with a major 7th and a major 9th. So that would be like a minor 9th chord we saw earlier, but with a major 7th instead of a minor one. And that can be noted as minor major 7, major 9. So for a C minor major 7th major 9th chord, that would be the root note C, the minor 3rd E flat, the perfect 5th G, the major 7th B, and the major 9th D. That's a chord that can be a substitute for the 1st degree in a minor tonality. So in the tonality of A minor, the A minor chord could be replaced by a A minor major 7th major 9th chord at some point. So that are 11 different types of 9th chord to experiment with in your compositions. That's a lot of options. But remember that your chords don't have to be all 9th chords. 9th chords are great to add color to a chord progression, but it may not be the color you want for each chord. So as always, just trust your ears. One way that can be good to voice this 9th chord is to have some notes clustered in the middle, with some notes a bit apart in the bass and some notes a bit apart in the higher notes. So you would have the color of a 9th chord in the middle, but with a more defined bass and a more defined melody. So in this video, we'll try to take a bit of everything we saw in this series and apply it to harmonize a melody. To make it easier, a few months ago, I've made a document gathering a lot of useful information we've seen. I also made a video summing everything up and explaining how that document works. So I'll leave a link to the PDF file and the video down below in the description. So let's begin. Let's say the melody we want to harmonize is this one. The first step would be to find the tonality it could be in, so we would have a set of chords to start with. So if we check the notes of the melody, we have a C sharp, a D, a E, F, G, A, and B flat. So we have 7 different notes already, which is good. That means that we may already have all the notes of the scale we are going to use. And to find this scale, we're going to use the cycle of fifth. I'll leave a link in the description to the episode that talks about the cycle of fifth, in case you need to refresh your memories on how it works. So we have one flat note, which is B, and we have one sharp note, which is C. If we look at the minor and major tonalities around the circle of fifth, on the flat side, we have a tonality here with one flat note, which is B, because that's the first note to become flat. The problem is, in this scales, the C is natural and not sharp. Now, if we look back at our melody, we notice that it begins and ends on a D, which is a good clue that the D has a central role in our scale. And in the D natural minor scale, the 7th note C can be raised by a semitone, so the scale becomes the D harmonic minor scale. So the D harmonic minor scale is the scale we were looking for, which means our tonality is D minor. Now, the best way to harmonize this melody would be to create a clear chain of chords that would fit the notes of the melody. The best way to start would be to define which chords we can use in the tonality we have. So in D minor, the first degree, the chord made from the first note of the scale, is D minor. The second degree is E diminished. The third degree is F major, the fourth degree is G minor, the fifth degree is A minor, but it can also be a A major, that's when the C becomes C sharp, or you can use a A dominant 7th on this degree as well. Then the 6th degree is B flat major, and the 7th degree is a C major chord. From there, you can start assigning chords to some parts of your melody, the notes of your melody being either the root note, the 3rd, or the 5th of the chord you use below it. So let's see how these chords could fit our melody. In the first bar, we have a D, a F, and a A, which are the notes of a D minor chord. So let's begin with that. Then we have a G, a F, and a E. We can decide to neglect the F because it's on a weak beat, so it would be just a passing tone between the G and the E. The G and the E here can be the root and the 3rd of a E chord, or they can be the 3rd and the 5th of a C chord. But here I decided to consider them as the 5th and the 7th of a A dominant 7th chord, by adding the root notes A and the major 3rd C sharp. It's a chord that can be used on the 5th degree, and that resolves well on a degree 1. And sure enough, we have a D at the end of this bar, so we can land on a D minor chord here. Having this 1-5-1 chord progression can really accentuate the tonality of D minor with this authentic cadence 5-1 that is very conclusive. It's a good way to establish our tonality. Then we have a D and a B flat, which can be considered as the 3rd and the 5th of a G minor chord. And the last bar starts with a C sharp, which is the 7th note of our scale that is raised by a semitone. And this alteration is often seen in a minor tonality on the 5th degree, when this chord that is normally minor becomes major. So let's put a A dominant 7th chord here. So we have in this bar the root notes A, the major 3rd C sharp, the 5th E, and the 7th G. This is a good example to show that you don't always need to harmonize every note of your melody, especially when they move stepwise from one to the other. With these two authentic cadences A7 to D minor, that's a very tonal chord progression that really establishes the tonality of D minor. But as I said earlier, there are always several ways to harmonize the same melody. So here is another example of how we could harmonize it. We still have the D minor at the beginning, the A7 at the end, and the G minor in the middle. But the first chord is cut in half, so the last F of the first bar is now part of a F major chord. The second bar is replaced by a C major chord based on the E and the G in the melody that are now the 3rd and the 5th of that chord. And in the third bar, the last note B flat becomes part of a B flat major chord. When you are harmonizing your melody, also keep in mind the rhythm with which the chords of your harmonic change. That's called the harmonic rhythm, and changing chords faster or slower can really change the feel of a song. Here is an example of the same melody harmonized with a lot more chord changes. I will write on screen the name of each chord, their function, and the role of the melody notes in each chord. And just for some variety, here is the last example. Now, just as we did, you can consider the notes of the melody like the root note, the third or the fifth of the chord that supports them. But they could also be the extensions of a chord like the seventh or ninth. For example, at the end of the first bar, we have a A and a F, and I like the change from a D minor chord to a B flat major chord there. But the A was not part of the chord B flat major. Yet this is not a problem, as this A can be considered as the major seventh of a B flat major chord. So that would turn the B flat major chord into a B flat major seventh chord. From the same principle, we could try to harmonize everything using extended chords like 7th and 9th chords, so that would open up a lot more possibilities. In the first bar, if we put a B flat major 7th chord, the D becomes the 3rd of the chord, the A becomes the 7th, and the F becomes the 5th. In the second bar, we have a F major chord with F, A, and C. So the E here becomes the 7th of the chord, and the G becomes the 9th of the chord. So the chord actually becomes a F major 9th chord, followed by a D minor 7th chord because we have a D in the melody and it's good to land on a 1st degree. But we can still keep the flavor of a 7th degree. In the third bar, we have a D and a B flat that I decided to consider like the 9th and the 7th of my chord. And the chord I've built is the C sharp half diminished 7th minor 9th chord, which is from the scale of D harmonic minor with the C sharp. We saw that in the last episode about 9th chord. And in the last bar, I've turned the A dominant 7th chord we had before into a A dominant 7th flat 9 by keeping the B flat from the previous chord. Then I doubled some notes of the melody a third below by using notes that were already in the chord progression. I just liked how it sounded. From there, we can go even further by using non-diatonic chords, chords that are not from the tonality we are in. You can do that by borrowing a chord from another tonality or by substituting a chord for another one. We saw several ways to do that in the episode about borrowings and substitutions, for which I will also leave a link in the description. But for the example, I will focus on the secondary dominants only. A secondary dominant is when you take any chord in your chord progression and for a moment you consider it like the 1st degree of its own tonality. So just before, you can put the 5th degree of that chord to prepare it. So this chord you put before is in the tonality of the next chord, but not necessarily in the tonality of the rest of the song. That's a secondary dominant. So here is how I harmonized this melody. In the first bar, we still have the notes D, F and A, which are the notes of a D minor chord, so I've put a D minor 7th chord for the flavor. And in the third bar, we have a D and a B flat, which I consider to be the 3rd and the 5th of a G minor 7th chord. So to introduce a secondary dominant, we can consider this G minor as the 1st degree for a moment. So just before it, we could put the 5th degree of the G minor scale, which is D major, or even D dominant 7th, which can work on this D in the melody. There is also one way you could extend this secondary dominant. A secondary dominant utilizes the tension of an authentic cadence, the tension of a 5th degree that wants to go back to its 1st degree. And it's a common practice to prepare this authentic cadence by putting a chord of the 2nd degree just before it. So the full authentic cadence would be 2, 5, 1. You can put the 2nd degree of the chord you want to go to just before the 5. That would make 2 chords that would not be necessarily in the tonality of the whole song. That is something that is used a lot in jazz, for example. Here, for example, we could use the A diminished chord just before the D7, because it would be the 2nd degree of the G minor tonality. The problem is the A diminished chord is made of the notes A, C and E flat, and we already have an E natural in the melody. Because I didn't want to alter the original melody, I used the A dominant 7th chord instead, which is in the tonality of our song.
Then to finish the chord progression on this C sharp, I've built a chord of C dominant 7 flat 9 because I didn't consider that as a C sharp but as a D flat. So the C is the root note, the E is the third, the fifth would be a G that is not there, the B flat is the seventh, and the melody, the D flat, is the ninth, the minor ninth. We saw this C7 flat 9 chord in the episode about ninth chords, and it is again often used on a fifth degree to then land on a first degree. So as C is the fifth of F, I've put a F major chord after, which utilizes the notes from the melody that are on the downbeat. Then, just because I was in this kind of gimmick, I've put a B flat major 7th chord to begin the next loop, because F is the fifth of B flat. So the chord progression would go down a fifth from D to G, then down a fifth from G to C, then again from C to F, and then from F to B flat. So it's like always going down on the circle of fifth. So we saw here an example of a non-diatonic chord with the secondary dominant. But you can also harmonize your melodies using all the chords, substitutions, borrowings and alterations we saw in the series. Just to name them, we saw the parallel chords, the altered 5th degree chords, the triton substitution, the Napolitan 6th, the Picardy 3rd, the Faurean cadence, the sus4 and sus2 chords, or even the Andalusian cadence. So I won't do an example for each of them now, as I think it would get very redundant at this point, and this video is already getting a lot longer than expected, but I hope this video was clear enough and that it gave you some ideas for your next songs. Diminished chords are often considered as dark sounding because they are rather dissonant. And this dissonance means tension, which means that they need to be resolved in a way or another. The good thing is that these chords are like actors that can play different roles, so they can be resolved in a lot of different ways. And this versatility makes them excellent tools to do modulations, to go from one tonality to another. We already saw different ways of making modulations in other episodes, and one particular technique was to utilize the tension of an authentic cadence to lead the progression toward a particular chord that would then become a new tonality. An authentic cadence is a progression from a degree 5 to a degree 1. That means that if I wanted to go to the tonality of E minor, for example, I could place a B7 chord just before the E minor chord to facilitate the transition. Because if E is my degree 1, then B is my degree 5. Here the B7 creates a tension that is then resolved by the E minor. Then we've seen in yet other episodes that you could alter the 7 chord in several ways, but one alteration we didn't see is the chord 7 flat 5. It is made of a root note, a major third, a diminished 5th and a minor 7th. So it's like a dominant 7th chord, but its 5th is lowered by a semitone. It's diminished. So when you're using a dominant 7th chord on a 5th degree, you have the option to use a 7 flat 5 chord instead. For our cadence in E minor, for example, it would sound like this. And for an example of a major tonality, in G major, it would sound like this. Now let's take a closer look at this 7 flat 5 chords, as it's getting interesting. Look at the interval separating each note. I will add the root note an octave above so we'll see better what's happening. You see the repeating pattern, 2-tone, 1-tone, 2-tone, 1-tone? If we make an inversion with this C7 flat 5, so we have the G flat at the base, this is still technically a C7 flat 5, but it is also a G flat 7 flat 5. If G flat is the root note, B flat is the major third, C is the diminished 5th, which should be called D double flat here really, but it's the same note, and E is the minor 7th. Again, it should be called F flat here, but it's the same note. So whenever you play a 7 flat 5 chord, it can be considered as two different chords, which are a triton apart, which makes it a great pivot point. For example, for our cadence in E minor, the B7 was transformed into a B7 flat 5, and that would also work to go to a E major even, but this B7 flat 5 can also be a F7 flat 5 to go to a B flat minor or a B flat major. Thing is, neither the B flat major or the B flat minor chords are in the tonality of E minor, nor in the tonality of E major. That's actually a pretty long jump on the circular fifth, so generally when we do that, it's to stay in the new tonality. So a 7 flat 5 chord is a better pivot point for a modulation than for a borrowing. Now if you like that kind of pivot point, you will love the diminished 7th chord. It's made of a root note, a minor third, a diminished 5th, and a diminished 7th. So on a C chord, that'd be a C, a E flat, a G flat, and a B double flat, which is the same note than A. In this chord, every note is separated by an interval of 1 tone and a half, which means you can consider any note at the root note, it will always be a diminished 7th chord. So when you introduce a diminished 7th chord in a progression, you can consider it as 4 different chords, which gives a lot of ways to resolve it. And that's the best part, there are a lot of ways to introduce and to resolve a diminished 7th chord. The diminished 7th chord can be found on a 7th degree, it appears naturally in the harmonic minor scale, but it can also be used in a major tonality as a borrowing, and it resolves well on a 1st degree. So in a tonality of C major or C minor, that would make a B diminished 7th chord that resolves well on either a C major or C minor. Note that if you add a G to this B diminished 7th chord, it will become a G7 flat 9, which works great on a dominant chord, which maybe also explains better why it resolves well on a C, G being the dominant of C. In a minor tonality, you can also use it on a 2nd degree to resolve on a degree 1, so in C minor that would be a D diminished 7th chord resolving to a C minor. A diminished 7th chord can also be used on either a raised 2nd degree to resolve on a degree 1 or on a raised 6th degree to resolve on a degree 5. In C major, that would be a D sharp diminished 7th chord resolving to a C major and a A sharp diminished 7th resolving to a G major. To make it easier to remember, a D sharp diminished 7th has the same notes than a C diminished 7th, so it's like a diminished 7th chord on a 1st degree resolving to a 1st degree. And the A sharp diminished 7th has the same notes than the G diminished 7th, so it's like a diminished 7th on the degree 5 resolving to a degree 5. Note that this last thing is generally not used to do modulations. It is generally used in the boundaries of one key, but it's a good way to introduce the diminished 7th chord. But as always, there is no rule set in stone in music. You can still try it, and the best judges will be your own ears. To sum it up in a simple way, a diminished 7th chord can be resolved on a chord a semitone above, either major or minor, or on a chord sharing the same root note, either major or minor. And to introduce a diminished 7th chord, you can place it on the 7th degree of your tonality or on the 2nd degree if you're in minor. These are the best options, I think. But you can also use it on a raised 2nd degree and on a raised 6th degree. So you have a lot of options to introduce a diminished 7th chord, which can be considered as 4 different chords, each of which have several ways to be resolved. Now to finish the video, I would like to make a little experiment. Let's focus on the C diminished 7th chord. It's made of the notes C, E flat, G flat, and A. So it can be considered as a C diminished 7th chord, a E flat diminished 7th, a G flat diminished 7th, or a A diminished 7th. From what we've seen in this video, each of these chords can be resolved a semitone above, so that's C sharp, E, G, and A sharp, each of which can be either major or minor. And they can also resolve to a chord sharing the same root notes, so that's C, E flat, G flat, and A, each of which can also be either major or minor. That would give a whopping 16 options to resolve one chord. So to test that, I've created clips in Ableton Live with every options, and then I have set that up so they play in random order. Right off the bat, we can foresee that the most repeated chord will be the C diminished 7th chord, as it's in every clip. So it should make it sound like the tonal center, as everything will be moving around that. But this tonal center wouldn't be very stable, as it's a diminished chord. So that should make the thing sound a bit weird, a bit mysterious, a bit haunted. Well, it should be interesting. So let's have a listen, and in the meantime, thanks a lot for watching. Today I would like to share with you a couple of tips and techniques on how to use any scale, because there are a lot of scales I added at the end of my music theory cheat sheet, so I figured it would be easier to use them with some tips on how to work with a scale you never worked with before. The best way to start with any new scale is to first figure out the chords that you can use with it. As an example, I will take the double harmonic major scale, which is also called the Byzantine scale. So in C, the notes of the scale are C, D flat, E, F, G, A flat and B. It's a very interesting scale with a lot of semitone intervals and a couple of 1 tone and a half steps. It sounds very cool. So to know which chords we can play with this scale, we'll simply see what triads we can build with its notes. So we start with the first one, and from there we'll follow the notes of the scale and keep one every two for our chords. Then we'll do the same starting with each note. With exotic scales, you will sometimes have several options for one chord, when the chord can be either major or minor, for example, and sometimes you will have weird intervals that can make it hard to identify the chords, or they won't make a proper chord at all, so you may just not use them. I took the Byzantine scale because it has an example of each, so let's see how it goes. So we start from C, and then we take one note every two. That makes C, E, and G, which makes a C major chord. Cool, we'll write that down and move to the next. From D flat, one note every two, that makes D flat, F, A flat, which is a D flat major chord. But then see what the E options we have. We could make a D flat minor chord if we take the D flat, the E, which is like a F flat, and the A flat. D, F, A, all flat. That's a D flat minor chord. From E we have E, G and B, which is a E minor chord, so far so good. But here again we could make this chord major, because we have an A flat in the scale, which is like a G sharp. So E, G sharp and B, that would be a E major chord. From F we have F, A flat and C, which is a F minor chord. From G we have G, B and D flat, which is a weird one because we have a major third with a diminished fifth. Well, if we can add a minor seventh, that could make a 7 flat 5 chord, and sure enough, this minor seventh would be a F, which is in the scale. So we can add a G7 flat 5 to our list of chords. Which works well in this particular case because that's a chord that is mostly used on a 5th degree, and we find it here on our 5th degree. All good. Then from A flat we have A flat, C and E, which makes a A flat augmented chord. And from B we have B, D flat and F, which is a major second with a diminished fifth. Which doesn't really make a chord, it looks more like just the upper part of the 7 flat 5 chord we saw earlier, so we won't use it. If you have a hard time identifying a chord, it's okay to just leave it aside. You may not use them all anyway. All you need is chords that work and that inspire you. So for this scale, the chords we have are C major, D flat major, D flat minor, E minor, E major, F minor, G7 flat 5 and A flat augmented. Now looking back at it, I realized I didn't consider some diminished and augmented chords we could also make with this scale. In C, we could make a C augmented chord with the notes C, E and A flat, which is like C, E and G sharp. In D flat, we could make a D flat diminished chord with the notes D flat, E and G, which is like a D flat, F flat and G. In E, we could make a E augmented chord with the notes E, A flat and C, which is like E, G sharp and B flat. And in F, we could make a F diminished chord with the notes F, A flat and B, which is like F, A flat and C flat. So you can start combining them to make a chord progression and improvise on it with the scale to find some good melodies. In the context of a solo, you can hold one chord and improvise with the whole scale on top of it. It works particularly well with the first chord of the scale, the degree 1, because that's the most stable in the tonality you're using. But holding a chord for a while can also allow you to switch to another scale while remaining on the same chord. The principle is that if you can make the chord with the notes of the new scale you want to use, then they are compatible. So you can mix and match all that. You can begin with one scale with its chord progression, then hold a chord for a while to add tension, then you can change the scale you play on top of it, and then you're free to go back to the first scale or to stick with the new one, and then use its own set of chords with it. When you take the notes C, D, E, F, G, A, and B, you have the C major scale. If you take the same notes but start on the D to have D, E, F, G, A, B, C, you have the second mode of the C major scale. In the same way, you could start from the third, the fourth, or the fifth note of the major scale to have it third, fourth, or fifth mode. These are the modes that we call Ionian, Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian, Aeolian, and Locrian. So the question is, if all these scales use the same notes, how can they sound different? How can we compose a song in one of these modes without making it sound just like it's major or minor? This is the question we'll tackle today. But an easy way to remember the name of those modes is to remember the sentence, "I don't punch like Muhammad Ali." Each word would give you the first letter of each mode. That's how I remember them. So the Ionian mode is the major scale, and the Aeolian mode is the natural minor scale. We won't focus on these ones as they are already explored extensively in other videos, but we'll use them as references to see what is unique about every other mode. To make that comparison easier, I will write all the degrees relatively to the major scale. To show you what I mean, I'll do it with you. I'll write the degrees of the major scale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. They represent the chords made with the notes of this scale. And for the minor scale, for example, the first degree is 1, the second degree is 2, because there is the same distance between the two first notes than in the major scale, which is 1 tone. But for the third degree, it's 2 tones above the root note in a major scale, but it's only 1 tone and a half above the root note in a minor scale. So I'll note that flat 3 to indicate that it's 1 semitone below its equivalent in the major scale. In the same way, I will note the degrees 6 and 7, flat 6 and flat 7, because they are also 1 semitone below their major equivalents. And that's how I'll note the degrees for each mode. Now the first step would be to figure out what type of chord we can find on each degree of each of these modes, so we can compare them to the more common major and minor modes. So for example, we'll start with the Dorian mode. In D Dorian, the first chord will be a chord of D, and it will be made of the notes D, F, and A, which makes a chord of D minor. So the first degree of the Dorian scale will be a minor chord. The second chord will be a chord of E, and it will be made of the notes E, G, and B, which makes a E minor chord. So the second degree of a Dorian scale will be a minor chord. So we'll do that for every chord based on every note in the scale to find the type of chord for every degree. And then we'll do the same thing for every mode. Once it's done, we have this and we can begin to analyze the data. One thing to keep in mind is that a major scale and its relative minor scale use exactly the same notes. The difference comes from the fact that they take different notes at their tonal center as their first degree. It is then a matter of using the other chord of the scale to create tension and make this first degree feel like home. And that's where the authentic cadence and the plagal cadence come handy, because they resolved well on the first degree. If you need to refresh your memories on the cadences, I will leave a link in the description for the episode about that. This is important because if we want to make the first degree feel like home, the first degree needs to be a rather stable chord, and that makes the Locrian mode very difficult to use because its first degree is a diminished chord, and that's not a stable chord by essence. It is dissonance, so it brings attention that leads elsewhere, which means it will be very difficult to make that feel like a home chord. So we won't really focus on the Locrian mode in this video. So when we are using a mode, the goal of the game is to make the first degree of that mode feel like home, so that's often the chord we'll use the most. And then we'll gravitate toward the more unique chords of the mode we're using to get the particular flavor of that particular mode. To find these unique chords, we'll compare each degree to their equivalent in the major and minor tonalities. If the chord is different from the one we find in major or in minor, then it is unique and we keep it, otherwise we'll gray it out. So on the second degree, we have a minor chord in a major tonality and we have a diminished chord in a minor tonality. So I'll gray out these options from the other modes and keep the others. The third degree is minor in major and flat 3 major in minor. So I'll gray those out. The fourth degree is either a major or a minor chord, so we'll gray those out as well. And we'll do the same thing for all the degrees until we're left with this. Here we can notice that we don't have many options for the Dorian and the Mixolydian mode, but we can still notice some interesting combinations. In the Dorian mode, we have a first degree that is minor, like in a minor scale, but the fourth degree is major, like in a major scale. And that combination is interesting because a progression for 4 to 1 is a plagal cadence, but we are more used to hearing it fall on a major first degree, so having a minor first degree here is unique to the Dorian mode. In the Mixolydian mode, we have a major first degree, like in a major scale, but the 7th degree is flat and major, like in a minor scale. And we are also used to hearing this major 7th degree go up a whole tone to a minor chord, so having a major chord here instead highlights the unique color of the Mixolydian mode. So now that we have all this data highlighted, here is how to compose in each mode. In a Dorian mode, use mainly the minor first degree and the major 4th degree. That creates a plagal cadence that makes the first degree feels like home. and this home is a minor chord, which is particular to that mode. In a Phrygian mode, you can use mainly the minor first degree and the major flat 2, which is a bit like a triton substitution, which is also a cadence that resolves well on the first degree. It should help make it feel like home, and you can then throw the minor 7th degree in the mix. In a Lydian mode, you can use mainly the major first degree and the major second degree. You can also use the minor 7th degree, but the risk is that if you go from the 7th degree to the 1st degree, it would sound like the 1st and 2nd degree of the Phrygian mode. And in a Mixolydian mode, you can use mainly the major flat 7th degree with the major 1st degree. That's a chord change that we used to hear in minor tonality, but here the 1st degree is major, which makes it sound different. You can use some of the diminished chords in each of these modes as well, but they can sound too dissonant for the song you want to make. And it is totally okay to use just a very few chords, as they are the chords that will bring the color of the mode you want to use. Quick note before wrapping up this video, I have updated my big music theory cheat sheet. Now it includes the chords for all these modes, and they are highlighted in the same way than in this video. You have 12 pages, one for each root note, so you don't have to transpose any of that yourself. It should make it easier to make borrowings. For example, say you are composing in E minor and you don't want to use a diminished chord on the 2nd degree. Well, you could replace it with a F major chord and resolve it with a E minor chord. That would be a borrowing from the Phrygian mode. Or you could replace it with a F sharp minor chord and resolve it with a E minor chord as well. And that would be a borrowing from the Dorian mode. I have also added all the 9th chords for the major and minor scales. I have added some substitutions for the 5th degree and have also corrected a couple of mistakes that were in there. So I hope all is clean now, and you can find a link to download this document down below in the description. So I hope you have fun with this. Thank you very much for watching. Take care, and I'll see you next time.